The cool darkness of the monastery dormitory began to soften, shifting by degrees from deep charcoal to a muted grey, as the first hint of dawn approached the narrow unglazed windows set high in the stone wall. Brother Edwin lay motionless on his straw pallet, wrapped in a rough woolen blanket, his breathing so shallow and regular that he might have been a carving on a tomb except for the faint cloud of vapour that formed near his lips in the cold air. He had been awake for some time already, his mind not so much thinking as quietly attending to the shape of the coming day, the way a man might listen to a distant stream before he rises to follow its course. The bell of the night office had rung hours ago, and the bell of the Lord's would not sound again for a little while yet. So he lay still, feeling the weight of his own body on the straw, the slight scratch of the ticking against his cheek, the cold stone floor just inches below him. Somewhere in the valley a tawny owl called twice, and then fell silent, and a few moments later the first blackbird of the morning began its tentative phrase, a few liquid notes that hung in the damp air before dropping away. Brother Edwin opened his eyes fully and regarded the wooden rafters overhead, their dark beams, shaped by an adze, long before he had come to this place, the grain of the oak catching the faintest glimmer from the eastern window. He sat up carefully, making no more sound than a shadow, and placed his bare feet on the cold flagstones, the chill spreading from his soles up through his ankles and into the calves of his legs, a familiar sensation that he had experienced every morning for the past 11 years. The other monks in the dormitory were stirring too, each man moving in his own small space, the rustle of blankets and the creak of wooden bed frames, the only sounds apart from the morning birdsong that was now growing more insistent outside the walls. Brother Edwin pulled his tunic over his head, the undyed wool smelling faintly of wood smoke and lanolin and the particular earthy scent of the monastery laundry, and he fastened the simple leather belt around his waist before stepping into his sandals, the leather cold and slightly damp from yesterday's dew. He walked with the others along the night stair into the church, the steps worn into shallow curves by generations of sandaled feet, and he took his place in the choir stalls, the wood dark and polished by use, and he began the familiar words of the office, his voice blending with the other voices until they became one sound rising into the high stone vault above them. When Lord's was finished and the monks processed out into the cloister walk, the sky had lightened to a pale pearl grey with streaks of lemon and rose along the eastern ridge, and the air was full of the scent of wet earth and budding hawthorn. Brother Edwin stood for a moment at the cloister entrance, looking out across the valley that lay cupped between the high moorland ridges like water in a giant hand. The monastery itself was built of the same grey stone that outcropped on the hillsides, a stone that seemed to absorb the early light rather than reflect it, so that the buildings appeared to grow directly out of the ground rather than to have been placed upon it. The church with its low square tower, the chapter house, the refectory, the warming room, the lay brothers' quarters, all arranged around the cloister garth where a few herbs grew in neat rectangular beds, the rosemary and sage silvered with dew. Brother Edwin walked to the small room off the cloister where the cellarer kept his accounts, the wooden door standing open as it always did in the morning, and he found Brother John the cellarer sitting on a three-legged stool with a wax tablet on his knee, scratching notes with a stylus. Brother John looked up and nodded once, the movement economical, and he said in a low voice that the new fish pond was to be begun today down in the lower meadow where the stream ran slow and the ground stayed wet long after rain, and that Brother Edwin would be the man for the work. He should take what tools he needed from the shed and make a start before the day grew warm, and if he needed the donkey later, he could fetch it from the stable field. Brother Edwin nodded in return, the way a man acknowledges a fact about the weather rather than receives an instruction, and he turned away toward the tool shed that stood against the outer wall of the monastery. The path to the tool shed was paved with irregular flagstones set into the earth, and between the stones, small cushions of moss grew in shades of olive and emerald, each one holding a tiny bead of moisture that soaked through the leather of his sandals as he walked. He lifted the wooden latch of the shed door and stepped inside, the air within smelling of dry wood and linseed oil and the metallic tang of old iron. He stood for a long moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness, and then he began to select the tools he would need. The spade came first. its blade of hammered iron fixed to a handle of ash wood that had been worn smooth by countless hands and polished to a soft sheen along the shaft, the end slightly splayed from years of being pushed into the ground. He hefted it, felt the balance point, ran his thumb along the edge to test for any burr that might need filing, and then set it aside against the doorframe. Next he chose a mattock, heavier than the spade, with a curved iron head that had a broad blade on one side and a pointed pick on the other, the whole thing fixed to a shorter handle of dense hawthorn wood, the grain rising in tight spirals. He lifted it and placed it beside the spade. Then a wooden bucket, coopered from oak staves bound with 2 iron hoops that had begun to rust at the edges, the handle a loop of twisted hemp rope that had frayed slightly at the ends. He tested the handle with a gentle tug and found it sound. He took a length of cord made from hemp, about the thickness of his little finger, wound into a tight coil that he could hang from his belt. This would serve for measuring and marking out the shape of the pond. Finally he picked up a small hand axe with a blade that curved like a crescent moon, its edge protected by a leather sheath, the handle short enough to tuck into his belt. He gathered the tools and stepped back out into the grey morning light, the bucket knocking softly against his leg as he walked. The route from the monastery down to the lower meadow was a track that had been made by the passage of feet and the occasional cart over many years, worn into the hillside so that the path sat slightly below the level of the surrounding pasture, its surface a mixture of compacted clay and small stones that glistened with moisture. Brother Edwin walked slowly, his sandals making a soft sucking sound as they lifted from the damp ground, and he allowed his gaze to travel across the valley that opened before him with every downward step. The slopes on either side rose steeply toward the moorland, their lower reaches covered with a patchwork of rough pasture where sheep moved like slow white specks, and above the pasture line the bracken and heather began, still brown from winter, but beginning to show faint tips of green at their bases. The ridge-tops were lost in a layer of mist that sat as still as a held breath, and from somewhere within that mist came the distant cry of a curlew, a long, liquid note that curved through the air and faded into silence. The stream that would one day feed the pond followed its own course through the valley floor, a narrow ribbon of water that ran over a bed of rounded pebbles and small flat stones, its surface broken into countless tiny ripples that caught the growing light and scattered it across the overhanging grasses. Alders grew along the banks, their roots clutching the soil in twisted masses, their catkins hanging motionless in the windless air, and beyond them stood a few old willows whose branches dipped low enough to brush the water, the new leaves unfurling in pale green points that looked almost yellow in the misty light. Brother Edwin paused on the path to watch a pair of dippers that were working their way upstream, bobbing on a stone for a moment before plunging into the current and emerging a few yards further on, and he noted the way the water moved, the slight gradient of the stream bed, the place where a gravel bank had built up and forced the flow into a narrower channel. After a few more minutes of walking, he reached the lower meadow, a flat expanse of rough grass that stretched between the stream and the rising ground to the east, perhaps 200 paces long and half as wide, its surface interrupted here and there by clumps of rushes that marked the places where the water table lay close to the surface. Even now, weeks after the last heavy rain, there were shallow hollows in the grass where water stood in grey pools, each one fringed with a rim of dark mud and reflecting the pale sky above like fragments of a broken mirror. The grass itself was coarse and tussocky, a mixture of meadow foxtail and crested dog's tail and the fine-leaved fescues that grew in the drier patches, and the whole area had the particular scent of wet pasture land, a smell both clean and faintly sour, the smell of vegetation that spent part of every year submerged. Brother Edwin stopped at the edge of the meadow and set down his tools, leaning the spade and mattock against a low alder branch while the bucket rested on a tussock, and the coiled cord hung from a stub of broken willow. He stood quite still for a long time, his hands hanging loose at his sides, and he looked at the ground. He looked at the way the grass grew in different shades of green according to the moisture beneath it, the darker patches indicating the wettest spots, the lighter areas showing where the ground rose slightly and the drainage improved. He looked at the line of the stream and calculated the distance from its bank to the center of the meadow, and he noted the slight fall in the land that would allow water to flow into a pond by gravity, without the need for any digging beyond the basin itself. The mist that had been lying along the high ridges was beginning to thin now, and a pale disk of sun was just visible through the cloud, casting a diffuse light that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and made no shadows. The work that lay before him was simple in conception, but vast in scale. He was to dig a hole in the ground, shape it into a regular basin, line the basin with clay puddled to a watertight seal, and then fill it from the stream, all so that the monastery might have fish on Fridays and on the many fast days that the rule prescribed. It was the sort of task that required no particular ingenuity or sudden inspiration, only persistence and attention to the small details of earth and water, and Brother Edwin felt no excitement at the prospect, but neither did he feel any reluctance or dismay. He felt simply the quiet recognition that this was the work he had been given, and that he would do it, one spadeful after another, until the pond was complete. He knelt in the wet grass, the moisture soaking through the wool of his habit at the knees, and he pressed his palm flat against the ground, feeling the temperature of the soil, the slight give of the turf, the solid resistance of the clay subsoil that lay beneath the dark topsoil like a firm promise. A few earthworms stirred near his fingers, their bodies glistening, and a single crane fly rose from the grass with a whir of transparent wings and drifted away toward the stream. The sound of the water running over its stony bed was a constant soft murmur that filled the air without intruding upon it, the sort of sound that had been in this valley since long before the monastery was built, and would be there long after, and Brother Edwin let it settle into the background of his awareness, the way he might let the sound of his own breathing settle there, not ignored but not attended to either. After a time he rose to his feet and walked a slow circuit of the area where the pond would be, pacing out the rough dimensions by eye, counting his steps, 43 paces long, 21 wide, with a slight widening at the southern end, where a natural depression already held a thin sheet of rainwater. The ground squelched under his sandals, and he noted the places where the footing was softer, the places where the turf gave way to bare mud, the single large stone that jutted from the grass near the eastern edge and would need to be levered out before digging could properly begin. He bent and picked a stem of grass, rolled it between his fingers to release its green scent, and then let it fall, watching it drift down and settle on the surface of a tiny puddle, its tip breaking the surface tension so that a ring of ripples spread outward in perfect circles. The sun had climbed a little higher now, and the mist was almost gone, retreating to the very tops of the hills where it lingered in the lee of the crags like wool caught from a thorn. The birds had grown quieter as the day began in earnest, only the occasional call of a wood pigeon breaking the stillness, that soft five-note coo that seemed to be made of the same stuff as the grey light itself. Brother Edwin sat down on a tussock of coarse grass that gave slightly under his weight, the blades pricking through the wool of his habit, and he allowed himself a moment of stillness before the labour began. He looked up at the sky, which was now a uniform pale grey with no edges or seams, a single vast cloud that stretched from ridge to ridge, and he thought about the clay that lay beneath his feet, the clay that had been deposited in some older, slower time, and would now be brought up into the light and reshaped by human hands into a vessel for water, a resting place for fish, a source of food for the brothers who would come after him. The monastery bell rang faintly from the slopes above, marking the hour of prime, and the sound travelled down through the still air as clearly as if it had been struck only a few yards away, each note hanging for a long moment before fading into the general hush of the valley. Brother Edwin listened until the last vibration had ceased, and then he rose and walked to where his tools leaned against the alder branch, his sandals sinking into the damp turf with each step, leaving a trail of dark impressions that slowly filled with water. He lifted the spade and weighed it in his hands, feeling the grain of the ash wood against his palms, the slight coolness of the iron blade, and he turned to face the wide, wet meadow that lay waiting before him under the soft April sky. The cord that Brother Edwin had brought from the tool shed lay coiled on the tussock where he had placed it, its hemp fibres pale against the dark green of the wet grass, and now he picked it up and began the slow work of marking out the shape of the pond. He moved to the centre of the lower meadow, where the ground was flattest and the stream ran closest, and there he drove the first wooden peg into the turf, a length of hazel that he had sharpened with a hand-axe, until its point was a four-sided taper, the fresh white wood glistening with sap. He pushed it into the soil with a firm downward pressure, twisting it slightly so that it found its way between the grass roots and into the denser earth beneath. And when it stood firm and upright, he looped the end of the cord around it and tied a simple clove hitch that would hold against any moderate pull. The cord was marked with knots tied at regular intervals, each knot stained with a little smear of wood ash to make it visible against the pale hemp, and the distance between the knots corresponded to the length of Brother Edwin's foot, measured 10 times over. He had made these markings himself the previous winter, during the long evenings in the warming room, sitting with the cord stretched across his knees while the other monks read or mended their habits, and he knew each knot by touch as well as by sight. Now he walked eastward from the first peg, paying out the cord as he went, counting 7 knots for the 40 paces that would form the pond's longer side. And when he reached the last knot, he stopped and drove a second peg into the turf, drawing the cord taut between them so that it lifted just above the blades of grass, a straight line humming with the tension of its own fibers. From this second peg he turned at a right angle, judging the squareness by eye and by a lifetime of working with wood and stone and earth. And he walked southward along what would be the pond's shorter end, counting 21 paces, and there he set a third peg and pulled the cord around it. Then westward again, back toward the stream, 40 paces more, the cord now describing 3 sides of a rectangle that enclosed a patch of meadow that looked, from where he stood, no different from the meadow on either side of it, except that it was now defined by this thin line of twisted hemp. The fourth peg went in at the final corner, and he tied the cord to it before walking back to the first peg and completing the circuit, bending to check each knot as he passed, tugging gently at each peg to ensure it had not loosened. The shape was a modest rectangle with corners that he had rounded slightly by eye rather than making them sharp, because a pond with sharp corners would be harder to line and harder to keep clean, and the natural basins he had observed in the world seemed always to favour curves over angles. Standing now at the centre of the marked area, Brother Edwin could sense the slight fall of the ground toward the south, a gradient so gentle that it was barely perceptible except as a faint inclination of his body when he closed his eyes and let his weight settle equally on both feet. He walked to the southern end and knelt, placing his palm flat on the grass, and he felt that the moisture here was fractionally greater than at the northern end, the ground yielding just a little more under his pressure, and he understood that the water from the stream would gather naturally in this lower part if he shaped the basin accordingly. He untied the cord from the southernmost pegs and adjusted the line, moving the boundary outward by half a pace, so that the pond would extend far enough to catch the full volume of the stream's overflow, and then he walked the perimeter a second time, then a third, each circuit identical in its steps but unique in the small details he noticed. A patch of clover that would need to be removed, a slight hummock that would have to be levelled, a small anthill built of fine dark soil that had been abandoned and was now crusted with a thin land hard to abide. With each circuit, the shape became more certain in his mind, not merely a set of lines on the grass, but a hollow waiting to be dug, a future filled with still water. The level he checked with a simple wooden trough that he fetched from the tool shed, a length of alder wood about the span of his arm, hollowed out along its upper surface and filled with water from the stream. He carried it carefully across the meadow, the water trembling but not spilling, because he walked with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who has carried many full vessels across uneven ground, and he set the trough down on the grass inside the marked rectangle, orienting it north to south so that he could see whether the water sat level or whether it crept higher at one end. The surface of the water was a small grey mirror reflecting the sky, and he bent low to peer at it, his face appearing as a dim shape overlaid on the clouds, and he saw that the water was very nearly level, with only a slight tilting toward the south that confirmed what his feet had already told him. He lifted the trough and moved it to the crosswise direction, east to west, and the water showed him a similar shallowness of slope, so gentle that a fish would hardly notice it. Satisfied that the ground would serve, Brother Edwin now set about the task of clearing the turf that covered the whole area. Turf was not something to be discarded or wasted. It would be stacked and later used to cap the pond's banks, its dense mat of roots helping to hold the clay liner in place and to provide a firm walking surface around the water's edge. He fetched the spade from where it leaned against the alder and he began at the northern end, standing just inside the cord line and facing south with the morning light falling over his left shoulder. The first cut was always the hardest because the blade had to part the tight weave of grass roots that had been knitting themselves together for years, a fibrous neck that resisted the iron with a springy tenacity. Brother Edwin placed the spade's blade against the turf, setting its edge precisely on the cord line, and he pressed down with his foot on the top of the blade, his weight driving the iron through the thatch and into the dark soil beneath with a low crunching sound. He worked the handle back and forth slightly to widen the cut, and then he withdrew the spade and made a second cut parallel to the first, about the width of his hand away, so that he had defined a narrow strip of turf. A third cut across the end, freed the strip, and he bent and lifted it with both hands, the turf coming away with a soft tearing noise as the last roots parted from the earth. The underside of the turf was a revelation of hidden order, a dense mat of fine white rootlets that held the dark soil in a compact layer no thicker than his thumb, and below that the soil was a rich, crumbly brown that fell away in small clods as he turned the turf over. He examined this first piece for a moment, noting the earthworm channels that threaded through it, the tiny pale eggs of some insect clustered in a crevice, the single small pebble of white quartz that had been carried up from the glacial deposits far below and now sat embedded in the dark loam like a pearl in velvet. Then he carried the turf to the edge of the marked area and laid it grass-side down on the ground, beginning a low wall that would grow as the work progressed. The second strip of turf came away more easily than the first, because the cut on one side was already made, and Brother Edwin settled into a rhythm that was as regular as the monastery bell. Place the spade, press with the foot, lever back, cut across, lift, carry, place, return. The shush of the blade slicing through roots was the dominant sound, a soft whisper that repeated every few heartbeats, and behind it the murmur of the stream ran on without pause, and above it the occasional call of a rook from the alders made a counterpoint of rougher texture. His breathing became part of the rhythm too, a slow inhalation as he lifted the turf and carried it, a slow exhalation as he placed it on the growing stack and turned back for the next cut, and the whole sequence had the quality of a chant, a bodily office performed under the grey sky. The turf varied in colour and texture from one part of the meadow to another, and Brother Edwin noticed these small differences as he worked across the rectangle. Near the northern end, where the ground was slightly higher and better drained, the grass was finer and the root mat thinner, the soil beneath lighter in colour and more friable, crumbling easily as he lifted each piece. As he moved southward into the lower ground, the grass became coarser and the roots grew thicker, the soil darker and heavier, clinging to the roots so that the underside of the turf was a solid cake of black earth that weighed more in his hands. In some places, the turf was so wet that water squeezed out when he lifted it, running in small rivulets down his wrists and dripping from his elbows, and in other places it was drier, the roots snapping cleanly with a sound like tiny threads breaking. From time to time the spade's blade struck a pebble, a sharp click that travelled through the iron and into the ash handle and up through his palms, and each time he paused and bent to pick the pebble out, dropping it into the separate pile of stones that was growing near the alder tree. These stones were of all kinds, rounded grey cobbles worn smooth by ancient rivers, angular fragments of the native gritstone that had broken from some crag and worked their way down through the soil, chucks of white quartz that caught the light, and occasionally a piece of dark flint that must have travelled a long way from some chalk country far to the south, carried by trade or by glacial ice. Each stone had its own history, but in the stone pile they all became simply stones, their individual stories submerged in a common heap. When he had cut 10 strips of turf, Brother Edwin paused and straightened his back and looked at the work he had done, a narrow cleared strip of dark earth running north to south along the pond's eastern edge, perhaps 4 feet long and marked by the parallel cuts of the spade. The stacked turf beside it was a low wall of green and brown, the grass blades already beginning to wilt and curl at the edges, and a small beetle was making its way across the topmost piece, its carapace gleaming like dark copper. He flexed his fingers, which had grown stiff from gripping the spade handle, and he walked to the stream and knelt on the gravel bank and dipped his hands in the cold water, holding them there until the chill had numbed the ache from his knuckles. The water was so clear that he could see every detail of the pebbles on the bed, their colors intensified by the wetness, and a water boatman skated across the surface nearby, its legs dimpling the water without breaking through. He returned to the work and continued cutting turf along the eastern edge, extending the cleared strip yard by yard until the whole long side was defined by a band of bare dark earth and a low rampart of stacked turfs. Then he turned and began the southern end, working across the shorter dimension. And here the ground was wetter still, so that the spade sank into the turf with less resistance and the mud squelched under his sandals at every step. The hem of his tunic was soon caked with a grey-brown sludge that dried in the air and formed a stiff crust, and his hands became coated with the same material, so that his skin and the ash handle seemed to merge into a single earthy colour. The work continued for an hour, perhaps two, the time measured not by the monastery bell, but by the slow progress of the cleared strip around the perimeter, and the sun remained hidden behind the uniform cloud, its position marked only by a faint brightening of the greyness overhead. At the western edge near the stream, the turf was different again, coarser and thicker, and shot through with the roots of alder and willow that had crept outward from the bank. And here the spade encountered a network of woody fibres that resisted the blade and had to be cut with a sawing motion. Brother Edwin fetched the mattock and used its broad blade to chop through the thicker roots, the sound a dull thud that carried across the meadow, and after each chop he paused and pulled the severed root from the ground, a long pale tendril that dripped sap and smelled faintly of aniseed. The stream continued its murmur a few feet away, and a dipper flew past at ankle height, following the water's course with quick wing beats, and Brother Edwin watched it go, before returning to the mattock. When the perimeter was fully cleared of turf, a band of dark earth perhaps 3 feet wide running all the way around the marked rectangle, Brother Edwin stepped back and surveyed the area once more. The shape of the future pond was now visible as an outline of bare soil enclosing a central island of still untouched grass, a green raft floating in a brown sea, and the symmetry of the form pleased some quiet part of his mind that appreciated order without needing to name it. He walked the boundary again, this time on the bare earth rather than on the grass, and he noticed how the soil under his feet was already beginning to dry in the air, its surface cracking into tiny polygons that curled at the edges like the pages of a miniature book. Now he began to cut the turf from the central area, working inward from the edges in a methodical spiral that would eventually strip the whole rectangle. The rhythm of the work was the same, but the conditions shifted with every few strips as the ground changed underfoot, and Brother Edwin let his attention move outward to the valley while his body continued its steady labour. The mist had returned to the high ridges, a thin veil that softened the outlines of the crags, and the rooks had gathered in the alders and were making their harsh cawing conversation that sounded like stones being knocked together. A light breeze had risen, barely enough to stir the grass, and it carried the scent of damp wool from somewhere higher up the valley where the sheep must have been gathered. Every 100 turfs, more or less. Brother Edwin paused and straightened his spine and looked up at the sky, not to check the time or the weather, but simply to rest his eyes from the near distance of the ground. The grey cloud was unchanged, a uniform blanket that seemed to have no intention of breaking, and the light was the same diffuse brightness it had been since dawn, a light that made no shadows and gave no sense of the passing hours. He counted the turfs in his mind not deliberately but by habit, a tally that accumulated somewhere in the back of his awareness as his hands moved through their tasks, and when the tally reached roughly 100, he would stop and stand still for a while, allowing his breathing to deepen and his shoulders to loosen before bending again to the spade. The stacked turf wall grew higher as the morning wore on, a low green rampart that now ran all around the pond's edge except where a gap had been left at the southern end for the future overflow channel. The smell of the exposed earth filled the air, a clean mineral smell that mixed with the scent of bruised grass and the faint sweetness of the stream, and small birds had begun to investigate the cleared area for worms and insects, a robin hopping boldly across the bare soil, and a pair of wagtails picking their way along the turf stacks with their characteristic bobbing gait. Brother Edwin did not disturb them, and they in turn seemed to accept his presence as a part of the landscape, no more threatening than the alder tree or the grey boulder that stood at the meadow's edge. The light thickened slowly toward a brighter quality, that suggested midday without ever resolving into direct sun. And Brother Edwin had now cut perhaps 600 or 700 turfs, the central island of grass shrinking with each circuit of his spiral path, until it was a small green patch no larger than a refectory table. The bare earth that had been exposed was a dark, rich brown, studded here and there with the white gleam of quartz pebbles and the glistening ribbons of earthworms that had been disturbed by his spade and were now burrowing back into the safety of the deeper soil. He looked at the ground he had cleared and saw the first hints of what lay beneath the dark topsoil, a paler layer just showing at the southern end where the ground was lowest and the topsoil thinnest, a greyish band that glistened faintly in the dampness and that he knew from long experience to be the beginning of the clay subsoil that would form the pond's waterproof heart. The monastery bell rang for sext, its notes falling through the still air like drops of water into a pool, and Brother Edwin laid the spade across the turf stack and walked to the stream to wash his hands and face before the midday prayer. The water was cold and clean, and it ran over his skin with a freshness that felt almost like a blessing, and he sat for a moment on a flat stone by the bank, his feet in the shallow flow, watching the minnows dart away from his toes. Then he rose and began the slow walk back up the clayey path to the monastery, leaving the half-cleared meadow silent under the soft grey sky, the cord still stretched between its pegs and the turf stacks standing like small outposts of order in the wilderness of grass. The midday prayer had come and gone, its words settling into the stones of the church like water into dry ground, and Brother Edwin walked back down the clay track toward the lower meadow with the taste of the small meal still faint on his tongue. The grey sky remained unchanged, a single vast cloud that diffused the afternoon light evenly across the valley, so that every blade of grass and every pebble seemed to glow with its own pale radiance. The rooks in the alders had grown quiet, and the stream murmured its endless low note, and the meadow lay waiting exactly as he had left it. The dark squares of cleared earth, and the green rampart of stacked turfs and the length of cord still taut between its pegs. He stood for a moment at the edge of the cleared area, looking at the rectangle of bare soil that he had exposed, and he considered the work that must follow. The turf was gone, carried away and stacked, and now the true digging could begin. Beneath his sandaled feet, the topsoil layer extended downward for the depth of a man's forearm. A dark, rich earth that had been built by centuries of fallen leaves and rotted grass roots and the patient labour of worms. And below that lay the subsoil, paler and leaner. And below that, the clay seam that would become the pond's lining. The topsoil was too loose and too full of organic matter to hold water for long, too hungry and alive, and it would have to be removed entirely, every spadeful of it, until the pond basin rested on the firmer ground beneath. Brother Edwin fetched the spade from where it leaned against the turf stack, the ash handle now darkened with sweat and soil from the morning's work, and he walked to the northern end of the rectangle where the ground was highest. He chose a starting point to pace inside the bare perimeter, leaving a margin of untouched soil that would later be shaped into the pond's sloping banks. And he set the spade's blade against the earth at a shallow angle. He pressed down with his foot, the iron sliding into the dark soil with a soft crunch, and he levered the handle back and lifted the first slice of topsoil, a thin shaving no thicker than his thumb, its underside glistening with moisture. He pivoted at the waist and tossed the spadeful onto the grass beyond the cleared area, where it landed with a quiet thump and began to form a new mound, separate from the turf stacks, a mound that would grow as the digging progressed. The exposed surface where the slice had been removed showed the colour that lay just beneath the rooty uppermost inch, a deeper brown than before, almost black in the diffuse light, the colour of old leaf mould and well-rotted compost. Brother Edwin knelt and took a pinch of this earth between his thumb and forefinger and rubbed it gently, feeling its texture, its slight grittiness from tiny mineral particles, its cool dampness, the way it held together when pressed, but crumbled when prodded. It smelled of the deep earth, a scent both clean and dark, the scent of all the summers and autumns that had passed over this meadow and left their slow deposits. He let the soil fall from his hand and stood again, brushing his palm on his tunic. The work resumed in the same steady rhythm he had established that morning, but now the nature of the labour had shifted. Cutting turf had been a matter of slicing through the mat of roots and lifting away a coherent piece. Digging topsoil was a looser, more repetitive action, the spade shaving away the dark earth in thin layers and tossing it aside. He worked in narrow strips a pace wide, moving from north to south and then back again, and with each pass the floor of the pond basin dropped by the thickness of a single spade slice, perhaps 2 inches at a time. The downstroke, the slight shift of weight from his right foot to his left, the pivot of his torso as the spadeful swung outward, the release of the soil onto the mound, the return of the blade to the cut. These motions followed one another in a sequence that became so familiar that his body seemed to carry them out without any instruction from his mind. The color of the earth changed as the hole deepened, and Brother Edwin observed this change with the quiet attention of a man who has spent many years watching the ground yield its secrets. At the surface, the soil had been a rooty brown flecked with fragments of grass and the pale threads of dead roots. An inch or two down it became that rich black-brown, heavy with humus and crisscrossed by worm channels that showed as darker streaks against the general darkness. As he dug deeper, the color shifted again, fading from the almost black of the humus layer to a lighter brown that had a slightly grayish cast, the sign that he was approaching the transition zone, where the topsoil gave way to the subsoil proper. This grey-brown earth was less crumbly and more silty, and it held the mark of the spade blade clearly, a smooth, slick cut that shone faintly before drying to a dull finish. The work took him across the entire rectangle in slow passes, each pass removing a little more of the dark earth and lowering the floor of the basin by a careful increment. He did not hurry, because hurrying would lead to uneven digging and a pond floor that sloped or dipped unpredictably, and the rule of his order taught patience in all things, patience in prayer and patience in labor, the two being aspects of a single obedience. So he worked at the pace his breathing set for him, a pace that could be maintained from sunrise to sunset without exhausting the body or dulling the mind, and he let his thoughts drift across the surface of his awareness while his hands attended to the spade, the soil, the mound. The increasing clay content made itself known gradually as the depth of the basin approached the full thickness of the topsoil layer. At first it was only a slight stickiness on the blade, a thin film of greyish material that clung to the iron and refused to fall away when he tossed the soil aside. He scraped the blade clean with a flat stick he had found among the alders, a piece of dead wood about the length of his hand and the width of 2 fingers, worn smooth by stream water, and the scraping produced a soft grating sound and left the iron bright and clean for the next cut. But as the hole grew deeper, the clay became more prominent, and the soil he lifted was heavier and wetter, clinging to the spade in thick clumps that had to be shaken loose or scraped off. The color had now shifted to a definite grey-brown, the grey predominating, and the texture was silkier underfoot, the particles finer and more cohesive. At a depth of roughly 2 feet across most of the rectangle, Brother Edwin paused and climbed out of the hole, his sandals slipping slightly on the damp earth of the sloping bank, and he walked around the perimeter to look at what he had uncovered. The basin was now a shallow bowl of grey-brown earth, its floor flat and even except for a few slight undulations that he would correct in the next passes, and the dark topsoil had been entirely removed from the central area and was piled in a long, low mound to the east of the pond. This mound was a mixture of the black humus-rich upper soil and the greyer lower soil, all of it blended together by the repeated tossing of the spade, and it would make excellent garden earth for the kitchen's vegetable beds and herb plots. He made a mental note to tell Brother John the cellarer about it when the pond was finished. The monastery bell rang for none, its notes falling through the grey air and spreading across the valley like ripples across still water, and Brother Edwin straightened his back slowly, feeling the muscles along his spine lengthen and release after the hours of stooping. He scraped the spade blade clean with the flat stick one final time and laid the tool across the turf stack, and then he walked to the stream to wash the clayey soil from his hands and forearms. The water was cold against his skin, and it carried away the grey silt in pale clouds that swirled downstream and vanished among the pebbles. He cupped his hands and drank a few mouthfuls, the water tasting faintly of the moorland peat from which it had come, and then he sat on the flat stone that had become his accustomed resting place and let his gaze travel across the meadow. The afternoon light was beginning to take on the faintest warmth, the grey cloud thinning just enough to allow a suggestion of the sun's position, a bright patch in the west that cast no shadows but lent the air a slightly golden quality. The elders along the stream were in full leaf now, their leaves a fresh, bright green that seemed almost luminous against the grey sky, and the willow catkins had shed their yellow pollen and were beginning to develop the fine, silky seeds that would soon fill the air like soft snow. A pair of mallards flew low over the meadow, following the course of the stream, and their wings made a whistling sound as they passed, a clean, rushing noise that faded quickly into the general murmur of the water. After a suitable rest, Brother Edwin rose and walked to the turf stack where he had left the small bundle of food that the kitchen had given him for the day's labour. The bundle was a square of coarse linen tied with a piece of twine, and he untied it and spread the cloth on the grass beside him, revealing a thick slice of dark bread made from rye and barley flour, a small onion with its papery brown skin, and a pinch of salt wrapped separately in a scrap of linen. He sat on the turf stack, the grass blades of the uppermost turfs now wilted and dry and prickling through his habit, and he ate slowly, breaking the bread into small pieces and chewing each mouthful thoroughly before swallowing, the nutty flavour of the rye filling his mouth. The onion was sharp and crisp, its white flesh releasing a pungent juice that made his eyes water slightly, and he ate it in alternating bites with the bread, the salt adding a bright mineral note that cut through the earthiness of the other flavours. While he ate, he looked at the half-dug pond basin and considered the work that still lay ahead. The topsoil was now mostly removed, and the next depth would bring him into the subsoil proper, a layer of yellowish-grey material that was denser and more compact than the soil above it, shot through with rust-coloured streaks where iron had leached from the minerals and oxidized in the presence of water. Below that, if the seam he had glimpsed earlier was any guide, lay the blue-grey clay that would form the pond's liner, the waterproof heart of the whole enterprise. He calculated the remaining depth, another foot or so of subsoil, then perhaps half a foot of the clay seam itself, and then the shaping of the banks and the puddling of the clay liner, and finally the slow filling from the stream. It was a long task, but a simple one, and he felt no impatience, only the quiet certainty that each day would bring its portion of the work, and that the pond would be finished when it was finished. A robin hopped onto the turf stack a few feet from where he sat, its red breast vivid against the grey-green of the wilted grass, and it cocked its head and regarded him with one bright eye. Brother Edwin broke off a small crumb of bread and placed it on the turf beside him, and after a moment the robin darted forward and seized the crumb and flew off toward the alders, its wings making a soft, whirring sound. He watched it go and then folded the linen cloth and tucked it back into his belt, and he stood and brushed the crumbs from his lap and returned to the pond basin. The digging resumed, the spade now biting into the transition zone where the topsoil gave way to the subsoil, a layer of indeterminate colour that was neither dark brown nor grey, but something in between, a dun colour like the coat of a field mouse. The soil here was more compact and required a firmer push of the foot to drive the blade in, and it lifted in larger, heavier clods that broke apart reluctantly when tossed onto the mound. The clay content continued to increase, and the spade blade needed scraping more frequently, the flat stick wearing gradually shorter with each use, its end becoming rounded and polished by the repeated contact with the iron. Brother Edwin worked his way across the basin in narrow strips as before, but now he was shaving away the last of the dark soil and exposing the yellowish subsoil that lay beneath, a colour like old parchment or the belly of a trout. The contrast between the two layers was striking when seen side by side, the dark topsoil and the pale subsoil meeting in a wavy line that followed the contour of the original ground surface, dipping where the old meadow had dipped and rising where it had risen. In some places the boundary was sharp and distinct, and in others it was blurred by centuries of worm activity and root growth. The dark and pale soils intermingled in a complex braiding. As he dug, he uncovered things that had been buried in the topsoil. A piece of pottery no larger than his thumbnail, its surface marked with a faint cross-hatched pattern and its edges worn smooth by years in the ground. A broken hazelnut shell so old that it had turned black and brittle. A small flint flake that someone had struck from a core long ago, its edges still sharp, a tiny remnant of some earlier presence in the valley. Each of these things he examined briefly and then placed on the side of the mound where they would not be lost, small witnesses to the history of the ground he was reshaping. He felt no particular wonder at these finds, only a mild curiosity that quickly passed, and he returned to the rhythm of the spade. The afternoon wore on, the grey sky maintaining its uniform brightness, the air neither warming nor cooling, the only movement, the slow rise of the mound on the eastern side of the pond, and the slow sinking of the basin floor. Brother Edwin's tunic was now thoroughly soiled, the undyed wool stained with grey-brown mud up to the knees, and smeared across the chest where he had wiped his hands, and his sandals were caked with a thick layer of clay that added weight to every step. He paused occasionally and stretched his arms above his head, feeling the pull of the muscles across his shoulders, and each time he looked up at the sky and noted that the light had shifted slightly, the bright patch in the west growing larger and softer as the afternoon advanced. When the light began its slow turn toward evening, the topsoil was entirely gone from the pond basin. Every spadeful of the dark earth transferred to the mound that now stood as high as a man's waist and stretched for the full length of the pond's eastern side. The floor of the basin was a level platform of the grey-brown transitional soil, and in places the underlying subsoil was already showing through, a paler yellow-grey that gleamed faintly in the dimming light. Brother Edwin scraped the spade clean one last time and set it against the alder tree, and he walked around the perimeter of the hole, checking the straightness of the sides and the flatness of the floor, his sandals leaving deep impressions in the soft earth of the banks. The pond basin was now a visible hollow in the meadow, a dark shape cut into the green, and the stream murmured beside it, as it had murmured all day, as it would murmur through the night and into the next morning when the work would begin again. The morning of the second day arrived with the same soft grey light and the same muted bird song, as if the valley had simply exhaled once during the night, and then inhaled again to resume its slow rhythm. Brother Edwin walked down the familiar path to the lower meadow, while the dew still clung to every blade of grass, his sandals leaving a trail of dark impressions in the silvery wetness. The pond basin waited exactly as he had left it, a shallow rectangular hollow of grey-brown earth, and the mound of dark topsoil on the eastern side had settled slightly overnight, its surface cracked into a network of fine fissures where the moisture had evaporated. He stood at the edge of the hole and looked at the floor, noting the patches where the paler subsoil was beginning to show through the last remnants of the transitional layer, and he understood that today's work would take him into a different kind of ground entirely. He fetched the mattock from the alder tree and stepped down into the basin, the earth cool and slightly yielding under his feet. The spade had served well for the loose topsoil, but the subsoil would be denser and more stubborn, compacted by the weight of centuries and laced with stones that had lain undisturbed since the glaciers dropped them. The mattock's broad blade was better suited to breaking up this harder ground, its curved iron head heavy enough to bite deep when swung, and its picked point could lever out the stones that the blade uncovered. Brother Edwin hefted the tool in both hands, feeling its balance, and then he began at the northern end of the basin, swinging the mattock in a short arc that drove the blade into the earth with a dull thud. The subsoil was immediately different from anything he had dug before. Where the topsoil had been dark and crumbly and the transitional layer soft and silty, this new material was firm and resistant, a pale yellowish grey that was the colour of old bone or the belly of a dead fire. It broke apart in angular lumps rather than crumbling, and the broken surfaces had a faint sheen that caught the light, the sign of clay minerals beginning to dominate the mixture. The matted blade sank into it with a satisfying chunk, and when Brother Edwin pried the lump free, he saw that the underside was streaked with rust-coloured lines, thin traces of iron that had percolated down through the soil over centuries and precipitated along the bedding planes, creating a pattern like the grain in a piece of timber. He worked the mattock across the basin floor in a systematic way, loosening a strip of subsoil about a pace wide and a few inches deep, then setting the mattock aside and using the spade to lift the broken lumps and toss them onto a new mound, separate from the garden soil. The lumps were heavier than the topsoil had been, each spadeful requiring a firmer heave, and they landed on the mound with a solid sound, a succession of soft impacts that marked the rhythm of the work. The colour of the pile was distinctly different from the dark mound beside it, a pale dun heap that looked almost like a mound of crushed chalk in the grey light. The stones were the second difference, and they demanded their own attention. The subsoil was full of them, far more than the surface layers had been, and every few strokes of the mattock brought the iron into contact with a stone with a sharp clink that rang through the handle and up into Brother Edwin's arms. He learned to anticipate these encounters by the slight change in resistance, a harder feel just before the blade struck, and he adjusted his swing to slow the impact and avoid damaging the iron edge. When a stone was uncovered, he bent and worked it free with his hands, prying it from its bed of compacted clay, and then he carried it to the stone pile by the alder tree, which had grown considerably since the first day. The variety of stones was a quiet education in the deep history of the valley. Most were rounded cobbles of a dark grey gritstone, smoothed by ancient water into shapes that fit comfortably in the palm, their surfaces marked with tiny pits where softer minerals had weathered out. Some were flat slabs of a finer-grained rock that split easily along their bedding planes, and these he set aside separately because they would make good stepping stones around the finished pond. There were angular fragments of quartz that sparkled with a greasy luster, and there were pebbles of a reddish sandstone that crumbled slightly at the edges, and there were occasional pieces of a hard black stone that he did not recognize, dense and fine-grained and cold to the touch. Each stone was lifted, examined for a moment, and then placed on the pile with the others, their individual shapes and colors merging into a single heap of gray and brown and white. The work deepened the basin, inch by inch across its entire floor, and Brother Edwin moved through the subsoil layer with the same patient regularity he had brought to the topsoil, his body settling into the new rhythm of the mattock and spade. The mattock swing was a different motion from the spade thrust, more of a full-body action that engaged the shoulders and the lower back, and he paused more frequently to rest, leaning on the mattock handle and letting his gaze travel across the valley. The grey sky had thinned a little, and a pale disk of sun was just visible through the cloud, a silver coin that cast no shadows but lent the air a brighter quality. The rooks had returned to the alders, and their cawing sounded fainter now, as if they had moved further up the valley. The stream continued its low murmur, and a light breeze had risen, stirring the grass on the meadow and carrying the scent of damp earth and budding hawthorn from the hedgerows on the higher slopes. At a depth of roughly 3 feet, measured by the height of the turf stack against the sky, the character of the ground began to shift again. The yellowish-grey subsoil gave way to something denser and more plastic, and the color changed by degrees from pale bone to a definite blue-grey, the color of a winter sky reflected in still water. Brother Edwin noticed the change first in the way the mattock blade stuck in the ground, not with the hard resistance of stone, but with a clinging suction that made each extraction require a slight extra pull. He knelt and examined the cut surface, pressing his thumb into the material and watching the impression remain, a neat oval that did not crumble or fill with loose grains. He took up a handful of the new material and worked it in his palm, his fingers kneading it as a baker kneads dough, and the clay responded by becoming smooth and plastic, taking on the shape of his hand, and then holding that shape when he opened his fingers. It was a pure clay, blue-grey and dense, with none of the sand or silt that had characterized the layers above. He rolled it between his palms and formed a small cup, a rough bowl no larger than an acorn cup, and then he walked to the stream and dipped the cup into the water and held it up. The clay held the water without leaking, the surface of the liquid trembling but not sinking into the material, and after several minutes the cup was still sound, its walls firm and impermeable. This was the liner material he needed, the waterproof heart of the pond, and there was more of it beneath him, a seam of unknown thickness that ran through the valley floor like a layer of butter between slices of bread. He placed the clay cup carefully on the turf stack and returned to the basin, his mind now working in a slightly different direction. The discovery of the clay seam was not a surprise. He had expected something like this from the way the ground had behaved higher up, the increasing stickiness of the transitional layer and the iron streaks in the subsoil. But the quality of the clay was better than he had dared hope, smooth and dense and entirely free of the stones that had plagued the upper layers. It would make an excellent liner, one that would hold water for years without cracking or leaking, and the fact that the seam lay across the entire basin floor meant that he would not have to dig far to find enough material for the puddling. He stood in the center of the hole and looked down at the blue-grey surface that was now exposed in patches across the floor, and he considered how best to proceed. The clay seam itself was not the bottom of the excavation. He needed to dig deeper still, removing the clay and setting it aside so that it could later be puddled and respread as the liner, and underneath the clay there would be more subsoil or perhaps bedrock, a firm foundation on which the liner could rest. He decided to widen the excavation before deepening further, extending the hole outward to its final dimensions so that he would have room to work and so that the clay could be removed in an orderly way. The banks of the pond needed to slope inward at about 45 degrees, a gentle angle that would prevent slumping and allow the clay liner to be applied evenly, and he had left the margins untouched until now, a wide shelf of the grey-brown transitional soil that surrounded the deeper central area. He spent the remainder of the morning working on the eastern bank, cutting into the shelf with the mattock and shaving the earth away in thin slices that fell into the basin and were then lifted out with a spade. The angle of the slope was a matter of constant attention, checked by eye and adjusted with each cut, and he used a length of cord with a pebble tied to one end as a rough plumb line, holding it against the slope and watching how the weighted cord hung relative to the surface. The ideal angle was one that would hold the clay without slumping and would also allow a man to walk down to the water's edge without slipping, and he worked slowly toward this ideal, stepping back frequently to look at the overall shape. The bank work was quieter than the floor excavation because the transitional soil was softer than the subsoil and contained fewer stones, and the mattock blade sliced through it with a gentle shushing sound that was more like the cutting of turf than the chunk of deeper digging. The soil here was still dark enough to hold the marks of the blade clearly, each cut leaving a smooth facet that caught the light differently from its neighbours. And as the morning progressed, the eastern bank developed a faceted appearance, a series of flat planes that together formed a smooth slope. Brother Edwin worked along the bank from north to south, cutting the slope to a consistent angle and checking it with the plumb line every few paces, and gradually the eastern side of the pond assumed its final shape, a clean sloping plane that descended from the turf stack to the flat floor where the clay seam waited. The midday bell rang while he was finishing the southern end of the bank, and he stopped and straightened and wiped the sweat from his forehead with the sleeve of his tunic. The air had grown slightly warmer, the grey cloud thinning enough to let a faint warmth through, and the scent of the stream was stronger now, a clean aquatic smell that mixed with the mineral scent of the exposed clay. He ate his bread and onion on the turf stack as before, watching a pair of grey wagtails that were picking their way along the edge of the stream, their long tails bobbing with each step, and when he had finished, he walked to the stream and drank and washed his hands, and then sat on the flat stone for a while. Letting his shoulders relax, the afternoon work turned to the western bank, the side nearest the stream, and here the conditions were slightly different. The ground was wetter because of the proximity of the water, the transitional soil more saturated and heavier to lift, and the slope had to be cut more carefully to avoid undercutting the stream bank and causing a collapse. Brother Edwin worked slowly, testing the soil with his fingers before each cut, and he left a wider margin between the pond and the stream than he had originally planned, a buffer of untouched ground that would act as a natural dam. The stream continued its endless murmur a few feet away, and once a kingfisher shot past in a streak of electric blue, too fast to see clearly, leaving only a high-pitched whistle that hung in the air for a moment before fading. By the time the afternoon light began its slow shift toward evening, both the eastern and western banks were shaped, their slopes clean and even, and the pond basin had grown to its full planned width. The floor was now a level platform with a grey-brown transitional soil with patches of the blue-grey clay showing through, and the whole excavation had the look of a giant's footprint pressed into the meadow, a deliberate hollow that waited only for the deepening and the clay to complete its transformation. Brother Edwin collected the tools and scraped the blades clean with the stick, wiping the clay from the iron with a tuft of dry grass, and he leaned them against the alder tree in their accustomed place. He walked around the pond one final time before leaving, checking the slopes and the floor and the edges, and he noted the places that still needed work, a slight bulge on the eastern bank near the centre that would need to be shaved down, a patch of softer soil on the western bank that might need reinforcing, a few stones still half buried in the floor that would have to be levered out. He made a mental note of each item and then turned and climbed the bank, and stood on the grass above the pond, looking at the shape he had made. The turf stacks stood like low green walls around the perimeter, and the mound of dark topsoil rose beyond them, and the stream ran past as it had always run, and in the bottom of the hole the blue-grey clay gleamed faintly, a secret that the valley had held for millennia and was now beginning to reveal. The morning of the third day began with a light drizzle that was barely more than a mist hanging in the air, a fine wetness that settled on every surface without falling as distinct drops. Brother Edwin felt it on his face as he walked down the track from the monastery, a cool touch that was almost indistinguishable from the general dampness of the valley, and by the time he reached the lower meadow his tunic was covered with a silvery beading of moisture that sparkled faintly whenever he moved. The pond basin lay before him, its floor now a patchwork of the grey-brown transitional soil and the first exposures of the blue-grey clay, and the banks on either side rose in their new clean slopes to the turf stacks that marked the original ground level. He stood at the edge and looked down into the hole, and he understood that the next phase of the work would require a different approach from the digging that had occupied him until now. The clay seam that ran across the basin floor was the treasure of the excavation, the material that would seal the pond and hold the water for years to come, but it had to be taken out before it could be put back. Every lump of that blue-grey clay needed to be dug from its bed, carried to a clean working area, and stored in a way that kept it moist and workable until the moment came to puddle it into the liner. The volume of clay was considerable, spread across the entire floor of the pond and extending downward for a thickness he had not yet fully measured, and moving it by hand one basket at a time would take many days and much labor. He had known this from the start, and he had planned accordingly. The donkey that grazed in the monastery stable field would be his partner in the carting, and a rough sledge would serve where a cart could not easily go. He walked first to the alder grove, where the trees grew thickly along the stream and offered a ready supply of straight poles. The alder was a forgiving wood, not as hard as oak or as brittle as ash, and it grew quickly in the damp ground, sending up shoots that were as straight as spears when young and as thick as a man's wrist when mature. Brother Edwin selected 4 poles of roughly equal length, each about the span of his outstretched arms, and he cut them with the hand axe, the blade slicing through the green wood with a crisp sound that was swallowed immediately by the damp air. He trimmed the side branches and the rough bark, leaving the wood smooth and pale, and then he cut 2 shorter cross pieces from a thicker branch that had fallen during the winter, its surface already beginning to soften with rot at the edges, but still sound at the core. The sledge came together on the grass beside the stone pile, a simple frame of the 4 long poles laid parallel with the cross pieces lashed across them using lengths of the hempen cord. Brother Edwin tied the knots carefully, pulling each one tight and testing it with a sharp tug, and when the frame was secure, he wove a platform across it using thinner withes cut from the willow, bending each one in a shallow arc and tucking the ends under the side poles. The finished sledge was a rough rectangle of wood, its front edge slightly curved upward so that it would not dig into the ground when pulled, and it was light enough for the donkey to drag even when loaded with clay. He fitted a harness from the sledge's front crosspiece, a loop of hemp rope padded with a piece of old sacking where it would pass across the donkey's chest. The donkey itself was a small grey animal with a pale muzzle and large ears that moved constantly, tracking sounds that Brother Edwin could not hear. Its name was Martin, a plain name for a plain beast, and it being with the monastery for many years, doing the quiet work of carrying firewood and pulling the small cart that brought vegetables from the garden. Brother Edwin found Martin standing in the corner of the stable field under a hawthorn tree, and he approached slowly, speaking in a low murmur that was less words than a stream of gentle sound, the sort of noise that animals find calming. The donkey turned its head and regarded him with one brown eye, and then it walked forward and pressed its muzzle against his chest, leaving a damp mark on the wall. He rubbed the animal's forehead and slipped the halter over its head, and together they walked slowly down the track to the lower meadow, the donkey's hooves making a soft clopping on the clayey path. At the meadow, he led Martin to the flat working area he had prepared beside the pond, a patch of ground that he had cleared of grass and levelled with the spade, and he fitted the harness across the donkey's chest and attached the sledge. The animal stood placidly while he adjusted the ropes, its tail switching occasionally to dislodge a fly, and when everything was ready, Brother Edwin lifted a woven willow basket from the tool pile and stepped down into the pond basin to begin the loading. The basket was one he had made himself during the winter months, its willow withes woven in a simple over and under pattern that left small gaps between the strands. strong enough to hold wet clay without splitting. The excavation of the clay seam was a different kind of digging from what had gone before. Not the slicing of turf or the removal of crumbly soil, but a deliberate extraction, a mining of a particular material that needed to be kept intact. Brother Edwin used the mattock's pickhand to break the clay into manageable lumps, striking along the natural fracture lines that ran through the seam like the joints in a piece of stone, and then he lifted each lump with both hands and placed it in the basket. The clay was cold and heavy and slightly sticky, and it came away from the bed with a soft sucking sound that reminded him of the mud in the stream bank. The lumps were irregular in shape, some flat and some rounded, their surfaces slick with moisture, and they ranged in color from a pale slate blue to a deeper gray that was almost purple in the shadowed light of the excavation. When the basket was full, he lifted it, the weight settling into his arms and pulling at his shoulders, and he carried it up the sloping bank and set it onto the sledge platform, positioning it carefully so that the load would be balanced. He made a second trip and a third, each basket holding roughly the same amount of clay, and with each load the sledge settled a little lower on its runners, the wood scraping against the grass. The donkey stood motionless throughout the loading, its breathing slow and regular, and occasionally it turned its head to watch Brother Edwin with a mild curiosity that seemed to ask nothing and expect nothing. When 4 baskets were loaded and the sledge was reasonably full, Brother Edwin took hold of the halter and clicked his tongue softly, and Martin leaned into the harness and began to walk with a slow, steady plod that was the pace of all donkey work since the beginning of donkeys. The sledge slid across the grass with a gentle hushing sound, the runners burnishing the wet blades and leaving 2 faint trails that glittered where the moisture had been pressed out. The journey from the pond's edge to the clay storage area was no more than 40 paces, a short distance even at a donkey's walking speed, but every step of it was filled with the small details of the labor, the creak of the harness leather as it stretched and relaxed, the soft grunt of the donkey's breath, the way the baskets shifted slightly on the platform with each bump of the uneven ground, the sight of Brother Edwin's hand resting lightly on his neck, not pulling or steering but simply accompanying. At the storage area, a clean patch of grass to the north of the pond where the ground was slightly higher and well drained, he stopped the donkey and began to unload. He lifted each basket from the sledge and tipped it over, the clay lumps tumbling out in a cascade of blue-gray chunks that landed with soft thuds and began to form a low mound. The clay was so dense and cohesive that the lumps held their shape even after falling, piling on top of one another in a jumbled heap that looked like a small range of miniature hills. When the sledge was empty, he turned the donkey and walked it back to the pond, the empty baskets rattling gently, and the whole cycle began again. Fill, carry, load, walk, tip, return. This circuit repeated many times as the morning passed, and Brother Edwin fell into its rhythm as naturally as he had fallen into the rhythm of the spade. The work was less physically demanding than the digging had been, more a matter of steady movement and careful handling, and he found that his mind could wander more freely while his body performed the familiar actions of lifting and carrying and leading. He thought about the clay itself, about the way it had been formed long ago in some ancient lake or slow-moving river that no longer existed, the minute particles of weathered rocks settling through still water and accumulating over centuries into this dense plastic seam. He thought about the fish that would one day swim in the pond, the bream and tench and pike that would feed the brothers on Fridays, and he thought about the rule that shaped every aspect of his life, the pattern of prayer and work and rest that turned the years into a gentle wheel. The donkey required little guidance, having learned the route after the first few trips, and it would stop at the clay mound and wait without being told, its large dark eyes gazing at nothing in particular. Brother Edwin spoke to it occasionally, a word or two of low-voiced encouragement that was more for his own company than for the animal's instruction, and the donkey's ears would swivel toward him and then away again, tracking the sounds of the valley. The squeak of the harness leather was a constant companion, a high, thin note that sounded with every step, and the stream's murmur underlay everything, and the rooks in the alders made their occasional comments, and the whole morning had the quality of a slow turning, a wheel whose spokes were the trips between the pond and the mound. By midday a substantial quantity of clay had been moved, the mound now reaching to Brother Edwin's waist and spreading outward in a rough circle several paces across. The surface of the mound was a chaos of angular lumps, wet and gleaming, and the smell of the clay was strong in the air. The clean mineral scent like the smell of a riverbank after rain. He unharnessed the donkey and led it to the stream to drink, the animal lowering its muzzle into the cold water and drawing long, slow draughts. And then he tied it to the alder tree, where it could graze on the lush grass that grew in the shade. He ate his own meal sitting on the turf stack as he had on the previous days, the bread and onion tasting of the same earth that he had been handling all morning. The afternoon work turned to the processing of the clay, a necessary step before it could be stored and eventually puddled. The raw lumps that came from the seam contained impurities that had to be removed, small stones that had become embedded, fragments of root from ancient vegetation, occasional pockets of sandier material that would compromise the watertight seal. Brother Edwin fetched the mattock and began to break the larger lumps into smaller pieces, using the back of the blade rather than the edge. A gentle tapping that shattered the clay along its natural planes without pulverizing it. The sound was a soft percussive rhythm, a series of muffled impacts that was gentler than the digging sounds of the previous days. And as he worked, he examined each fragment and picked out any foreign matter with his fingers. The impurities were placed in separate piles. Stones went to the main stone pile by the alder tree, their wet surfaces soon drying to a pale grey. Roots and woody fragments went to a small heap that would later be burned or composted. The rare bits of sandy clay were set aside for use in the less critical parts of the pond's construction, the outer banks, where a little leakage would not matter. The clean clay he left in a growing pile beside the original mound, a second heap that was composed of smaller, purer pieces, each one inspected and approved. The work was slow and meticulous, and he knelt on the grass as he did it, the dampness soaking through his habit at the knees, his fingers becoming coated with a smooth layer of grey clay that dried to a thin crust and then cracked as he flexed them. The afternoon breeze that had been barely noticeable in the morning strengthened a little, a movement of air that came from the west and carried the distant sound of sheep on the high pasture. It stirred the grass and ruffled the surface of the stream, and began to dry the exposed clay on the mound, the wet gleam fading from the outermost lumps and tiny cracks appearing along their surfaces, a fine network of lines that spread like the veins in a leaf. Brother Edwin noticed this drying and fetched the wooden bucket from the tool pile, filling it at the stream and carrying it to the clay mound. He dipped his hand into the water and sprinkled it over the clay in a wide arc, the drops falling with a soft pattering sound and darkening the pale grey surfaces as they were absorbed. He did this several times as the afternoon passed, each time walking to the stream and back, the bucket growing heavier as his arms tired, and each time the clay drank the water and returned to its moist sheen. The processing continued until the light began its slow turn toward evening, the clean clay pile growing while the raw mound shrank, and by the time the sun's pale disk touched the western ridge, the work was perhaps half done. Brother Edwin straightened his back and looked at the results of the day's labour. The pond basin deepened by another layer of the clay seam, its floor now fully exposed in a patch of unbroken blue-grey. The sledge parked beside the alder tree with the empty basket stacked on its platform, the donkey grazing quietly with a rope trailing loose on the grass. The two clay mounds, one of rough, unprocessed lumps and the other of clean broken pieces, standing side by side on the grass. He walked to the stream and washed his hands and arms, the cold water turning the clay into a thin grey slurry that swirled away downstream, and then he sat on the flat stone and let his gaze travel across the meadow. The valley was settling into its evening quiet, the rooks flying home to their nests in the alders with a final exchange of caws, the stream's murmur deepening as the light faded, a single bat flickering over the water in a series of sharp turns. Brother Edwin thought about the days ahead, the remaining clay still to be dug and carted and processed, the puddling that would transform the clean lumps into a seamless liner, the slow filling and the arrival of the fish. Each step would come in its proper time, and none of them could be hurried, and the pond would be ready when it was ready. He rose and collected the donkey, walking it back up the track to the stable field as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky above the eastern ridge, and the monastery bell rang faintly for Compline, the last office of the day, the sound travelling down through the still air like a stone dropped into deep water. The fourth morning arrived with a sky that had finally begun to lighten from its long grey vigil, the cloud thinning in the east to reveal a band of pale lemon light that spread along the ridge like a slow smile. Brother Edwin walked down the track through air that was noticeably warmer than on previous days, the first real warmth of the advancing spring, and by the time he reached the lower meadow, the fine drizzle of the day before had given way to a soft clarity that made every blade of grass stand out as if etched. The pond basin lay waiting with its floor of exposed blue-grey clay, now deepened and widened to its final dimensions, the banks sloping evenly on all sides, and beside the northern edge, the two clay mounds stood side by side, the larger one of rough, unprocessed lumps, now diminished by half, and the smaller one of clean, broken pieces, grown tall and neat. He fetched the donkey from the stable field, Martin the grey animal with the pale muzzle and the ever-moving ears, and led it down to the meadow where the sledge still stood beside the alder tree, with the empty willow baskets stacked upon it. The first part of the day's labour was not puddling itself, but the preparation of a puddling area, a shallow depression where water and clay could be mixed into the slurry that would later be spread across the pond floor. Brother Edwin chose a level spot on the grass near the stream, a few paces from the clay mounds, and he marked out a rough circle about the span of his outstretched arms, using the toe of his sandal. Then he took the spade and cut away the turf from within the circle, lifting the squares of grass and stacking them to one side, exposing the dark topsoil beneath. He dug down into the topsoil only a little way, no more than the depth of his hand, creating a shallow bowl that would hold water without being so deep that the donkey could not easily walk in and out. The excavated soil he piled around the rim to form a low lip that would help contain the slurry, passing it firm with the flat of the spade. When the bowl was shaped to his satisfaction, he fetched bucket after bucket of water from the stream, the wooden pail growing heavier with each trip, and he poured the water into the depression until a shallow pool stood in the bottom, its surface grey and still, reflecting the sky. Then he carried basket loads of the clean broken clay from the smaller mound and tipped them into the water, the blue-grey lumps landing with soft plops that sent ripples spreading outward and splashing against the earthen lip. He continued adding clay until the pool was half filled with the material, the water and clay forming a thick grey mixture that looked like the beginnings of a potter's slip. The clay lumps sat in the water for a while, softening and beginning to dissolve at the edges, and Brother Edwin used the spade to chop at them, breaking them down into smaller pieces that would mix more readily. The sound was a wet slapping different from the dry sounds of the previous days, and the clay yielded under the blade with a soft resistance that was almost pleasant. He worked his way around the depression, chopping and stirring, until the mixture was roughly uniform, a dense grey sludge that glistened in the morning light. Now he brought the donkey to the edge of the depression and led it in, the animal stepping carefully over the low lip and planting its small hooves in the slurry with a soft sucking noise. Martin stood for a moment uncertain, his ears flicking back and forth, and then Brother Edwin clicked his tongue and began to walk the donkey in slow circles around the bowl, the hooves lifting and falling in a steady rhythm that churned the clay and water together. The sound of the puddling was a thick, wet squelching, each step pressing into the mixture, and then releasing with a slight gasp of suction, and the slurry began to change in texture as the hooves worked it, becoming smoother and more homogeneous, a plastic mass that moved like heavy cream. Brother Edwin walked beside the donkey with his hand resting on its neck, guiding it in ever-widening circles from the center outward to the edges and then back again, covering every part of the depression in a methodical way. The animal's legs and belly were soon coated with a layer of grey clay that increased in thickness with each circuit, and the harness leather was spattered with drops that dried quickly in the warming air and left pale spots. The rooks and the alders watched with their heads cocked, and a single heron that had been standing motionless in the shallows of the stream lifted itself into the air with a slow flap of enormous wings and drifted away downstream. The sun climbed higher and the warmth increased, and the scent of the wet clay rose from the depression, a clean earthy smell that filled the lungs and settled on the tongue. When the slurry in the depression had reached the consistency he required, a smooth uniform paste that would flow slowly if tilted, but hold its shape when still, Brother Edwin halted the donkey and led it out of the bowl and down to the stream. He washed the clay from the animal's legs and belly with handfuls of cold water, the grey sludge streaming away downstream in long cloudy ribbons, and Martin stood with the patience of his kind, occasionally shaking his head so that his ears flapped against his skull. When the donkey was reasonably clean, Brother Edwin tied it to the alder tree where the fresh grass grew thick and cool, and he returned to the puddling bowl to begin the true work of the day. The puddled slurry now needed to be transported from the mixing depression to the pond basin and spread across the floor as a continuous layer that would become the waterproof liner. Brother Edwin filled the willow baskets with the wet clay, scooping it up with his hands because no tool worked as well for this dense, sticky material as the cupped palm and curled fingers. The clay was cold and smooth against his skin, and it squeezed between his fingers with a soft, intimate pressure, leaving grey crescents under his nails and filling every line of his palms. He carried each basket down into the pond basin, the weight sloshing slightly, and he tipped the contents onto the floor at the northern end, where the blue-grey clay of the original seam lay exposed and waiting. He spread the slurry with his hands at first, pushing it outward in a layer that was roughly the thickness of his thumb, smoothing the surface with broad sweeps of his palms. The clay was plastic and obedient, taking whatever shape he gave it and holding that shape without slumping, and it adhered to the underlying clay seam, as if the two materials recognized each other as kin. He worked in a narrow strip about the width of his outstretched arms, starting at the northern wall and moving southward, and he added basket after basket of the puddled clay, each load merging with the previous one so that the seams were invisible. The surface he created was not quite smooth yet, marked with the faint ridges and swirls left by his hands, but the overall effect was of a continuous layer of grey-blue material that was already beginning to hold a faint sheen of moisture from the air. When he had spread the slurry across perhaps a quarter of the floor, Brother Edwin paused and straightened his back and considered the next step. The clay needed to be compressed and polished, all the tiny air pockets and small fissures worked out of it, and for this the weight of a man's body would serve better than any tool. He sat on the edge of the unlined area and removed his sandals, the leather straps damp and stiff from the morning's work, and he set them aside on the bank. Then he hitched up the hem of his tunic, tucking the muddy cloth into his belt so that his legs were bare to the knee, and he stepped carefully onto the newly spread clay. The sensation of the cold clay against the soles of his feet was immediate and total, a soft yielding coolness that pressed up between his toes and cupped the arches of his feet. He stood for a moment simply feeling it, the way a man might stand in the shallows of a lake and let the water settle around his ankles. And then he began to walk. The first steps were tentative, his feet sinking slightly into the soft material, but as he moved the clay compacted under his weight and became firmer, supporting him with a gentle resilience. He walked in a slow methodical grid, starting at one corner of the spread area and moving in straight lines that overlapped by half the width of his foot, the way a ploughman turns his furrows. The rhythm of his steps was a soft, wet squelching, each footfall pressing into the clay and then releasing with a slight sucking sound, and the sensation of the material squeezing between his toes and smoothing under his weight was the central fact of his awareness. He trod the same ground multiple times, each pass pressing the clay a little more firmly into the underlying seam, working out any air that might be trapped, and the surface grew smoother and denser with each circuit. The clay that had been merely spread now became a compacted layer, its color deepening from a pale grey-blue to a darker slate as the moisture was pressed to the surface, and a thin film of water began to appear, a silvery sheen that reflected the sky. The grid walking took a long time because Brother Edwin was meticulous, covering every inch of the spread area with the same steady pace, and he varied the direction of his passes so that the clay was compressed evenly from all angles. When he had completed the first section, he stepped back onto the unlined area and examined the surface, kneeling to look along it at a low angle where any imperfections would show as shadows. The clay was smooth and glassy, with no visible cracks or pockets, and the sheen of standing water lay across it in a perfect mirror that trembled only slightly when he breathed. He fetched the flat wooden board that he had prepared the previous evening, a piece of alderwood about the size of a serving platter, its surface planed smooth with the hand axe, and then polished with a handful of fine sand from the stream bank. He knelt at the edge of the compacted clay and placed the board against the surface, pressing it down with both hands and moving it in slow circular motions, the way a plasterer smooths a wall. The board glided over the clay with a soft, hissing sound, and where it passed the surface became even smoother, the faint marks of his footprints disappearing into a uniform glassy plane. He worked the board across the entire section, overlapping each circle with the next. And when he was done, the clay was as smooth as the surface of a pond on a windless day, a perfect grey-blue mirror that held a thin film of water without leaking. The first section was complete, and Brother Edwin stood and stretched his spine and walked to the stream to wash the clay from his feet and legs. The cold water was a shock after the relative warmth of the clay, and he gasped once and then relaxed, letting the current carry the grey silt away. He sat on the flat stone and drank from his cupped hands and ate a small piece of bread, and he looked at the pond basin where the completed section lay like a fragment of fallen sky at the northern end. The contrast between the lined area and the still unlined floor was stark, the lined area a smooth dark mirror, the unlined area a rough patchwork of excavated clay lumps and trampled earth. He felt no particular pride in the completed work, only the quiet recognition that one part was done and the remainder still waited. The afternoon brought a repetition of the morning's labor, the same sequence of actions performed with the same careful attention. Brother Edwin mixed a fresh batch of slurry in the puddling depression, adding water and clay and chopping with the spade until the consistency was right, then leading the donkey in its slow circles until the mixture was smooth and plastic. The animal seemed to understand the routine now, walking the circles without needing to be guided, and Brother Edwin simply stood at the center and turned slowly, his hand resting on the donkey's warm flank. The sun had thickened the air with a faint haze, and the shadows of the alders lengthened across the grass, and the stream continued its murmur with the same patient note it had held since the beginning of the work. He carried basket after basket of the fresh slurry down into the basin, this time working on the middle section of the floor, and he spread the clay with his hands in the same even layer, the material cold and smooth and faintly granular in the places where a few fine sand grains had survived the processing. He removed his sandals and hitched his tunic and walked the grid again, the clay squeezing between his toes with the same intimate coldness, the squelch of his steps forming a slow rhythm that matched his breathing. The sensation had become familiar by now, almost comfortable, and his feet had grown accustomed to the chill, so that it no longer registered as a discomfort, but simply as a condition of the work. The board work on the middle section required more care than the first, because the join between the two sections had to be seamless. He applied a thin ribbon of fresh slurry along the edge of the completed section before spreading the new clay, and when he pressed and polished the join, he worked the board across the boundary in long sweeping strokes that merged the two areas into one. The seam disappeared, the fresh clay blending with the older until no line was visible, and the entire northern half of the pond floor became a single unbroken surface of grey-blue that gleamed in the afternoon light. He crawled across it on his knees, peering at the surface from different angles, and he found no cracks, no pockets, no imperfections at all, only the smooth glassy plain that held its sheen of water, like a promise. The evening approached with a slow fading of the light. The band of lemon in the east that had marked the dawn now matched by a band of pale rose in the west, and Brother Edwin completed the day's work by treading and polishing a small additional area at the center of the pond, a few square paces that would serve as the starting point for the next day's labor. He washed his tools and his feet at the stream, the water now tinged with the gold of the setting sun, and he led the donkey back to the stable field with a handful of fresh grass as a reward. The pond basin behind him lay half covered with its new liner, the completed section a dark mirror that reflected the sky and the alders and the first emerging stars, and the remainder a rough patchwork that would be finished in the days to come, one grid of footsteps at a time. The work of lining the pond floor had taken 3 full days, and now the basin bottom lay complete from the northern wall to the southern end, a continuous sheet of puddled clay that gleamed like dark glass under the grey spring sky. Brother Edwin stood at the edge of the lined area on the morning of the 7th day and looked at what he had made, his sandals still in his hand, and his bare feet cool on the grass of the bank. The floor was perfect in its smoothness, every square inch compressed by his own weight and polished by the wooden board, and a thin film of standing water that had seeped up from the clay itself lay across it without soaking away, a mirror that held the clouds and the alders and the slow flight of a passing crow. But the floor was only part of the task, and the sides of the pond still waited in their raw state. The sloping banks of transitional soil and exposed clay that rose from the floor to the turf stacks at the original ground level. He set his sandals on the grass and stepped down onto the finished floor, his bare feet meeting the cold, smooth surface with a familiar sensation that was no longer a shock, but simply the texture of the work. He walked to the eastern bank and stood looking at the slope that he had cut days earlier, a plane of grey-brown earth that angled upward at roughly 45 degrees and was marked with the facets left by the mattock blade. The soil here was the transitional layer he had exposed during the excavation, a mixture of the darker topsoil remnants and the paler subsoil, and it was stable enough to hold its shape, but too loose and too porous to hold water on its own. It would need the same clay liner as the floor, applied in a continuous layer that would seal the entire basin into a single watertight vessel, and the angle of the slope would make the work more delicate than the flat bottom had been. He fetched a basket of the puddled clay slurry from the mixing depression, the same smooth grey paste that he had been making and carrying for days, its consistency now so familiar that he could judge it by the weight of the basket and the way it sloshed against the woven willow sides. The slurry for the banks needed to be slightly stiffer than the floor mixture because it would have to cling to a slope without slumping, and he had adjusted the proportions that morning by adding a little more dry clay and a little less water, working the donkey in shorter circles until the paste held its shape when he formed it into a ball and set it on the grass. The ball sat without spreading, a grey dome that trembled slightly but kept its form, and he had nodded once and carried the first basket to the pond. Applying clay to a sloping surface required a different technique from the flat spreading of the floor. Brother Edwin knelt at the base of the eastern bank, where the floor met the slope, and he took up a handful of the slurry and pressed it against the bank with a firm upward motion, the clay adhering to the rough soil and filling the small hollows and crevices left by the mattock. He worked in a narrow strip from the bottom of the slope upward, pressing each handful of clay into the one below it, so that the layers overlapped like the scales of a fish, and the clay held its position without sliding because of its stiffer consistency and the slight roughness of the soil beneath. The sensation of the material under his hands was the same smooth coldness he had felt on the floor, but the angle of his arms and the reach upward made the work more tiring, the muscles of his shoulders and upper back engaging in new ways. He built the layer to the thickness of his thumb, the same dimension he had used for the floor, and he checked the evenness by running his palm over the surface in long, sweeping strokes, feeling for any thin spots or hollows. The clay responded to his touch by smoothing and compacting, and the surface he left behind was a grey-blue slope that glistened with the moisture he had pressed to the surface. He worked along the eastern bank in sections roughly the width of his outstretched arms, the same systematic grid that he had used for the floor but now oriented vertically, and each section was completed before he moved to the next, so that the clay would not have time to dry at the edges before the adjoining section was applied. The drying was a constant concern on the banks because the sloping surface was more exposed to the air than the floor had been, and the gentle breeze that moved through the valley carried away the moisture more quickly than he would have liked. He noticed the first faint cracks appearing at the upper edge of the earliest section, a fine network of lines that spread like the veins in an autumn leaf, and he fetched the wooden bucket from the stream and sprinkled water over the clay with a sweeping motion of his hand, the drops falling in a soft rain that darkened the pale grey surface and closed the cracks. He did this at intervals throughout the morning, the bucket trips becoming a subsidiary rhythm within the larger rhythm of the application, and the clay remained moist and workable under the grey sky. When the first course of clay had been applied along the entire length of the eastern bank, a band of grey-blue that covered the lower half of the slope from the floor to about the midway point, Brother Edwin paused and let the layer dry slightly before adding the second course. The drying time was a matter of judgment rather than measurement, a sense he had developed over years of working with clay and earth that told him when the material was firm enough to support another layer without slumping, but still moist enough to bond with the fresh application. He spent the waiting time on other tasks, carrying more baskets of slurry from the mixing depression, checking the donkey's water and moving it to a fresh patch of grass, examining the floor for any imperfections that might have appeared overnight. The floor remained perfect, its surface unblemished, and the thin film of water still lay across it without soaking away. The second course of clay on the eastern bank went on more easily than the first because the underlying layer provided a smooth surface that the fresh material could grip, and Brother Edwin built the thickness upward toward the rim of the pond, pressing each handful into place with the same firm upward motion. The upper edge of the clay liner needed to tuck into the turf stack that crowned the bank, sealing the rim so that water could fill the pond to its maximum depth without finding a way out through the soil layers. He cut a shallow groove along the inner face of the turf stack, using the hand axe, a narrow channel that would accept the clay and lock it into place, and he pressed the final course of slurry into this groove with particular care, working it deep with his fingers until the joint was solid and seamless. When the eastern bank was fully lined from floor to rim, Brother Edwin stepped back and examined the work from the opposite side of the pond, squinting slightly to see the profile against the sky. The slope was even and smooth, the clay surface a uniform grey-blue that matched the floor, and the transition from horizontal to sloping was a gentle curve rather than a sharp angle, a continuous surface that water would find nowhere to penetrate. He walked across the floor, his bare feet leaving faint impressions that would disappear when he polished the final surface, and he ran his hand over the join between floor and bank, feeling the seamless continuity of the clay. It was good work, and he allowed himself a single slow nod before turning to the western bank. The western bank was the side nearest the stream, and the ground here was wetter than the eastern side had been, the soil more saturated and the slope slightly softer underfoot. Brother Edwin approached the work with the same methodical care, but with an additional awareness of the water that lay only a few feet away beyond the turf stack, the stream that ran endlessly over its pebbled bed and would eventually feed the pond through the inlet channel he would dig when the lining was complete. The wetness of the bank was both a help and a difficulty. It kept the clay moist and reduced the risk of drying cracks, but it also made the underlying soil less stable, more prone to slumping if he applied too much weight or pressure. He worked more slowly on this side, building the clay layer in thinner courses and allowing more time between them, and he used the flat of his hand to press the clay gently rather than forcefully, the way a man might smooth a blanket over a sleeping child. The western bank took the whole of the afternoon, the light shifting slowly from the pale brightness of midday to the golden slant of early evening, and Brother Edwin's hands grew tired with the repeated pressing and smoothing. He paused occasionally and washed the clay from his palms in the stream, the cold water a brief refreshment, and he ate the last of his bread, sitting on the turf stack with his feet dangling over the edge of the lined floor. The rooks had grown quiet, and the stream's murmur seemed louder in the stillness, a constant background note that had been present since the first morning, and would be present long after the pond was finished and the fish were swimming. At the southern end of the pond, where the ground was lowest and the water would naturally gather, he had left a gap in the turf stack for the overflow channel. This channel was a narrow cut through the bank, no wider than his forearm, that would carry excess water from the pond back to the stream when the rains came and the water level rose above the desired height. The channel needed to be lined with the same clay as the rest of the pond, but its slope was gentler and its dimensions smaller, and the work of lining it was a delicate task that required him to lie on his stomach on the grass and reach down into the narrow cut with one arm, pressing the clay into place with his fingertips. The clay went on in thin smears, each one smoothed and pressed before the next was added, and the channel gradually acquired a grey-blue skin that would carry water without eroding the soil beneath. The overflow channel emptied onto a flat stone that he had placed at the base of the bank, a slab of the fine-grained rock he had found during the excavation, its surface dished slightly by natural weathering so that water would spread across it in a thin sheet before trickling into the stream. He bedded the stone in a cushion of clay and pressed the liner of the channel down onto its surface, sealing the joint so that no water could work its way underneath and undermine the structure. The joint was invisible when he finished, a smooth transition from clay to stone that would guide the overflow gently away from the pond and back into the stream's natural course. The light was fading now, the sky deepening from grey to a soft slate blue, and the first bats had appeared over the meadow, flickering in their sharp arcs. Brother Edwin stood and brushed the clay from his tunic, the crusted material falling away in pale flakes, and he walked a slow circuit of the pond to inspect the day's work. The eastern bank was complete, its slope a smooth grey plane that matched the floor. The western bank was nearly complete, only the upper rim remaining to be finished in the morning. The overflow channel was lined and sealed, its mouth opening onto the stream like a small grey tongue. The pond basin was now a single nearly enclosed vessel of clay, a bowl set into the earth, and only the northern bank and the final touches on the western rim remained before the liner would be whole. He washed his feet and hands in the stream, the water now dark with the reflected sky, and he gathered his tools and leaned them against the alder tree. The donkey had been returned to the stable field, and the meadow was quiet except for the stream and the distant call of a curlew from the high moor. Brother Edwin stood for a long moment at the edge of the pond, looking at the dark mirror of the floor and the pale slopes of the banks, and he thought about the water that would soon fill this space, the weight of it pressing against the clay, the stillness of it reflecting the sky, the fish that would move through it like shadows. Then he turned and walked up the track toward the monastery, the first stars appearing above the eastern ridge, the day's labour complete and the next day's labour waiting in the patient earth. The clay liner lay complete across the entire pond basin, a continuous skin of grey-blue that covered the floor and all four banks from the rounded rim down to the deepest point, and now it needed time to cure. Brother Edwin stood at the edge of the pond on the morning of the 8th day and understood that the labour of shaping and pressing was finished, replaced for a while by the quieter labour of watching and waiting. The liner was a living thing in its way, a material that would respond to the air and the sun and the moisture in the ground, and it could not be rushed into its final form any more than a tree could be rushed into leaf. He sat on the turf stack with his sandals dangling over the inner edge, and he looked at the work of the past days, the smooth grey slopes and the glassy floor and the small overflow channel at the southern end, and he settled himself into the patience that this phase demanded. The first change he noticed was the colour. The clay had been a dark blue-grey when freshly puddled, the colour of a winter sea or the breast of a storm petrel, and it had held a wet gleam that reflected the sky in a wavering mirror. As the morning passed and the air moved gently across the surface, the gleam began to fade from the uppermost edges of the banks, the clay there lightening by degrees to a paler grey that had a slight bluish cast, the colour of wood smoke or the bloom on the damson. The moisture was rising out of the clay and into the air, an invisible exhalation that left the surface fractionally drier with each hour, and the paleness spread downward from the rim, like a slow tide retreating across the slope. Brother Edwin watched this progression without intervention, knowing that the drying must happen at its own pace. If he wetted the clay now, it would only prolong the curing and possibly weaken the final seal. By midday the sun had found a gap in the grey cloud and was shining through with a thin warmth that was more suggestion than substance, a pale gold light that lay across the meadow without casting strong shadows. The clay on the banks continued to pale, and now the floor too was beginning to change, the deeper areas retaining their dark gleam longer than the shallower edges, but all of it trending slowly toward that smoke-grey colour. The surface developed a slight bloom, a powdery fineness that came away on his finger when he touched it, and the texture under his fingertip was no longer slick and plastic, but smooth and firm, like the skin of a cured cheese. He walked around the rim of the pond, his bare feet silent on the grass, and he examined every part of the liner from different angles, looking for the small imperfections that the drying might reveal. The first crack appeared in the early afternoon, on the western bank near the rim where the clay was thinnest and the exposure to the breeze was greatest. It was a hairline fissure no wider than a stalk of hay, running vertically down the slope for about the length of his hand, and it had opened so recently that the edges were still dark with moisture. Brother Edwin knelt on the grass above it and leaned down, tracing the crack with his fingertip, feeling its shallow depth. It was a drying crack, not a structural failure, the kind of small seam that opened when the surface of the clay shrank faster than the material beneath it, and it could be repaired easily enough with a dab of fresh slurry pressed into the gap. He fetched a small lump of the puddled clay from the mixing depression, the material still moist and plastic under its covering of damp sacking, and he worked a pinch of it into the crack with his thumb, pressing firmly and then smoothing the surface with a wet finger until the repair was invisible. He found 3 more cracks during the afternoon, all on the western bank and all of the same shallow hairline type, and he repaired each one in the same way, working the fresh clay into the fissures and smoothing the joins until the surface was whole again. The eastern bank remained sound, its slightly lower exposure to the breeze having slowed the drying just enough to prevent cracking, and the floor was still too moist to show any fissures at all. He walked the circuit of the pond several times, pausing to examine each section of the liner with the close attention of a scribe checking a manuscript, and he noted every tiny irregularity. A slight dip in the surface near the northern end, where the clay had settled a little, a small pebble that had worked its way up from the underlying soil, and was now visible as a bump, a faint ripple in the otherwise smooth finish of the overflow channel. Each of these he fixed in turn, pressing and smoothing and polishing until the liner was as close to perfect as his hands and his patience could make it. The sun moved across the sky, and the light shifted from pale gold to a warmer amber, and the clay continued its slow transformation. The smell of the pond basin changed as the day wore on, the clean mineral scent of wet clay giving way to a drier, earthier smell that was more like the smell of a riverbank in summer, a smell of stone and dust and the faint sweetness of decaying vegetation. Brother Edwin sat on the turf stack in the late afternoon and watched a pair of swallows that had arrived from the south and were now skimming low over the meadow, their forked tails tracing sharp patterns against the grey sky. The swallows dipped and turned, catching insects too small to see, and occasionally one would sweep across the pond basin at the level of the rim, its reflection flickering across the dark surface of the floor for an instant before vanishing. The night that followed was mild and still, the cloud cover returning to hold the day's warmth close to the ground, and Brother Edwin lay on his pallet in the dormitory and thought about the clay curing in the darkness, the molecules of water rising slowly from its surface and drifting away into the air, the microscopic shrinkage that would be occurring as the material settled into its final form. He did not worry about the pond. The clay would do what clay did, following the laws of its nature, and in the morning he would walk down and see what the night had brought and make whatever repairs were needed. The bell rang for matins, and he rose and prayed with the others, the familiar words filling the dark church, and then he returned to his pallet and slept without dreaming until the grey light of dawn woke him. The second day of curing brought a change in the weather. The cloud, that had been a uniform blanket for so many days, began to break apart, the edges of the grey masses fraying into wisps and tatters that revealed patches of pale blue beyond. The sun emerged more strongly than it had at any time since the work began, a warm spring sun that carried real heat, and the dew on the grass steamed faintly as it evaporated. Brother Edwin walked down the track with the sense that the day would be different from the ones before it, and when he reached the meadow, he saw that the clay had dried considerably overnight, its colour now a uniform pale grey across the entire basin, the dark wet gleam entirely gone. The surface was firm underfoot when he stepped down onto it, his sandals leaving only the faintest of impressions, and the texture was smooth and hard, like the surface of a cob wall that had been drying for weeks rather than days. He found more cracks this morning, a dozen or more spread across the banks, and even a few on the floor, all of them the same shallow hairline type that had appeared the previous day, and all of them easily repaired. He worked his way around the pond with a basket of fresh slurry, filling each crack and smoothing the repair, and the work had the quality of a meditation, a slow, repetitive attention to small details that occupied his hands while his mind rested. The sun climbed and the warmth increased, and he removed his outer tunic and worked in his undershirt, the wool clinging to his shoulders where the effort of leaning and pressing had brought a faint sweat. By midday the heat was considerable, the first real warmth of the year, and the clay began to dry more rapidly than he had anticipated. The repairs he had made in the morning were already curing, their darker grey blending into the paler surrounding surface, but new cracks were appearing even as he watched, tiny fissures that opened along the subtle contours of the banks. He understood that he could not chase every crack as it appeared. The clay needed to complete its shrinkage, and the cracks that opened now might close again when the water returned. He walked around the pond and noted the locations of the largest cracks and repaired only those, leaving the finer ones to the natural process of wetting and swelling that would occur when the pond filled. The afternoon brought a different kind of sky, the blue patches widening until the cloud was reduced to scattered white masses that moved slowly eastward on a gentle wind. The sun was full and warm, and the meadow grass began to grow visibly, the green intensifying hour by hour. Brother Edwin sat in the shade of the alder tree and watched the pond basin, the pale grey liner glowing almost white in the direct sunlight, and he thought about the water that would soon fill it. The inlet channel was already dug, a narrow trench that led from the stream to the pond's northern end, its mouth controlled by a simple sluice that he had made from a hollowed alder log. The log was about the length of his arm and the thickness of his thigh, its centre bored out with the hand axe and a long-handled auger borrowed from the monastery's workshop, and it was fitted into a gap in the turf stack, with the inner end projecting over the pond basin. A wooden plug wrapped in a scrap of oiled cloth served as the stopper, and when the time came, he would remove the plug and let the stream water flow through the log and into the pond. The time came on the third morning of the curing, when the clay had dried to a uniform hard surface that was no longer cracking, and the repairs had all cured to the same pale grey as the surrounding material. Brother Edwin stood at the inlet channel and looked at the stream running past a few feet away, its water clear and cold and endless. And then he bent and worked the wooden plug from the end of the hollowed log. For a moment nothing happened, the log's mouth a dark circle that seemed to hold its breath. And then a thin tongue of water crept over the lip and ran down the inner surface of the log and fell into the pond basin in a slender silver thread. The water landed on the clay floor with a soft pattering sound, the drops spreading into a dark stain that grew outward in a perfect circle, the dry clay drinking the moisture and darkening from pale grey to the deep blue-grey of wet slate. The flow was very slow, a trickle no thicker than his finger, and Brother Edwin had designed it that way, deliberately, because a rapid inflow would erode the clay liner before it had time to swell and seal. He sat on the turf stack and watched the water spread across the floor, the dark patch expanding inch by inch, the surface of the water so shallow that it was barely more than a film, a skin of silver that crept across the grey, like the shadow of a cloud. The sound of the trickling water was a light musical note that joined the stream's deeper murmur, a treble line above the base, and the swallows swooped lower to investigate the new wetness, their wings almost brushing the surface. The first hour of filling saw the water cover perhaps a quarter of the floor, the film deepening from a skin to a shallow pool a few inches thick of the northern end, where the inlet was, and the clay beneath the water began immediately to change. The surface that had been hard and dry softened as the moisture penetrated the microscopic spaces between the clay particles, and the material swelled slightly, closing the tiny cracks that had formed during the curing and pressing the particles together into an even denser seal. Brother Edwin walked around the pond and watched this transformation from different angles, and he saw the way the water crept outward with a smooth leading edge, the dry clay ahead of it, pale and firm, and the wetted clay behind it, dark and glistening. The transition between the two states was a sharp line that advanced across the floor with the slow inevitability of the tide, and the reflection of the sky in the wetted area was a perfect mirror of pale grey and scattered white cloud. He adjusted the flow several times during the morning, pushing the plug in a little further to reduce the stream when the water seemed to be rising too fast, pulling it out slightly when the advance slowed too much, and each adjustment required a careful attention to the behaviour of the clay. He watched the way the water interacted with the banks, the wetness creeping up the slope in a dark band that followed the rising water level, and he checked the western bank where the earlier drying cracks had been, looking for any sign of leakage. There was none. The cracks had sealed themselves when the moisture returned, the clay swelling tight against itself, and the water remained within the basin as securely as tea in a cup. The daylight hours passed with the pond filling by slow increments, the water level rising perhaps the thickness of his thumb each hour. Brother Edwin sat on the turf stack for long periods, simply watching, and the work of these days was the easiest work of all, because it required nothing but presence and attention. He ate his bread and onion in the shade of the alder, and he walked the circuit of the pond every hour or so, and he adjusted the sluice when adjustments were needed, and the rest of the time he let his mind settle into the same still patience that the clay itself embodied. The swallows grew accustomed to his presence and flew close around him, and a water-vole appeared at the edge of the stream and nibbled a stem of grass, its small bright eyes watching him without fear. By evening the water was ankle-deep across the entire floor, and had begun to climb the lower slopes of the banks, the dark band of wet clay rising with it. The surface of the pond was a perfect mirror now, a sheet of silver that reflected the evening sky and the dark shapes of the alders and the first pale star that had appeared above the eastern ridge. Brother Edwin pushed the plug firmly into the hollowed log to stop the flow for the night, and the trickling sound ceased, leaving only the stream's murmur and the distant call of a curlew. He stood at the edge of the pond and looked at the water he had brought into being, the still surface that held the twilight like a gift, and he felt the quiet satisfaction of a man who has done his work well and can now rest. The pond would continue to fill on the morrow and the day after that, until the water reached the rim of the overflow channel and the excess began its gentle return to the stream. And then the fish would come and the pond would begin its true life as a living part of the monastery's economy. He turned and walked up the track through the gathering dusk, leaving the water to the swallows and the emerging bats, the silver mirror fading slowly into the deeper darkness of the night. The morning of the fourth day after the filling began with a sky that was neither grey nor blue, but a soft milky white, a high veil of cloud that diffused the sunlight into a gentle radiance without source or shadow. Brother Edwin walked down the track from the monastery with the taste of the dawn prayer still on his lips, and when he reached the lower meadow, he saw that the pond had filled completely during the night, the water level now steady at the rim of the overflow channel, where a thin silver blade of excess flowed silently over the flat stone and into the stream. The surface of the pond was a perfect mirror of the pale sky, unbroken except where a single water beetle rode itself across the stillness in a series of tiny jerks that left a fading trail of ripples behind it. The clay liner had done its work. The water that now filled the basin from the deep center to the gently sloping edges was held as securely as wine in a glazed jug, and the only loss was the deliberate overflow that kept the level constant and prevented the banks from being overtopped during heavy rain. Brother Edwin walked the circuit of the pond, his sandals leaving dark prints in the dew-wet grass of the rim, and he checked every part of the liner that was still visible above the waterline. The clay above the water had dried to a pale grey that was almost white in the diffuse light, and it was smooth and hard under his hand, without cracks or fissures. The clay below the water was darker, a deep blue-grey that shaded to black in the deepest parts, and it was invisible except as a colour beneath the clear water, a darkness that gave the pond a sense of depth beyond its actual measure. The water itself was not yet perfectly clear. The filling had stirred a fine sediment from the clay surface, microscopic particles that now hung in suspension, and gave the water a faint milky cast, like whey or the thinnest of spring broths. This cloudiness would settle in time, the particles sinking slowly through the still water to join the clay floor, and the pond would clarify day by day until the bottom was visible even at the deepest point. Already at the shallower edges he could see the smooth grey surface of the liner, and here and there a small water snail had already found its way into the pond from the stream, a dark speck that moved with an almost imperceptible slowness across the clay. Brother Edwin sat on the turf stack and waited, because there was nothing more to do for the pond itself, and the next task would arrive in its own time. He had been told by Brother John the cellarer that a cart from the sister monastery at Rialfulks would be coming today or tomorrow, bringing the young fish that would stock the pond, and until then his duty was simply to watch and to be present. He watched the water settle and the reflection shift as the high cloud moved slowly eastward, and he listened to the stream which had been his companion through all the days of digging and puddling and lining, and he let the peace of the finished work settle into him the way the sediment was settling through the water. The cart arrived late in the morning, its approach announced by the sound of wooden wheels on the stony track that led from the valley head, a low grumbling that grew gradually louder and resolved into the creak of axle and the clop of hooves and the occasional voice of a man speaking to his horse. Brother Edwin rose from the turf stack and walked to the edge of the meadow where the track emerged from the alders, and he saw the cart coming slowly toward him, a sturdy two-wheeled vehicle built of oak with iron tires on the wheels and a bed of rough planks that carried two large wooden barrels. The barrels were coppered from dark staves bound with broad iron hoops, and their tops were covered with squares of coarse linen tied down with cord, and from within them came a faint splashing sound that was the first evidence of the life they contained. The driver of the cart was a monk of about Brother Edwin's own age, a man with a weathered face and hands that were broad and capable on the reins, and he wore the same undyed wool habit, but with a small difference that his was marked with a patch on the shoulder where it had been mended with a slightly darker thread. He drew the horse to a halt at the edge of the meadow and climbed down from the cart with the careful movements of a man who had been sitting for a long time, and he and brother Edwin greeted each other with the quiet courtesy of their order, a slight bow and a murmured blessing, and then a moment of silence that was not awkward, but simply restful. The fishmonger monk, whose name was Brother Simon, walked to the pond and stood looking at the water for a while, taking in the shape of the basin and the clarity of the water and the gentle overflow at the southern end. He nodded slowly, the nod of a man who understood the work that had gone into this hollow in the ground, and he said that the pond was a fine piece of work and that the fish would thrive in it. Then he returned to the cart and began to loosen the cords that held the linen covers on the barrels, his fingers working the knots with an easy familiarity. The first barrel held the bream, and when Brother Simon lifted the linen cover, the smell of fresh water and fish rose from within, a clean smell that was not unpleasant, but simply the smell of the river from which the fish had been taken. Brother Edwin stepped close and looked into the barrel, and he saw the bream swimming in slow circles in the cramped darkness, their bodies a deep bronze with darker fins that moved continuously to keep them steady in the sloshing water. The bream were young fish, each about the length of his hand, from fingertip to wrist, and they had been chosen at this size because they would travel well and then grow quickly in the still water of the pond. The transfer of the fish from the barrels to the pond was a slow and careful process that required a gentleness of touch and a patience of movement. Brother Simon had brought the necessary tool, a wooden ladle with a long handle that he had carved himself from a single piece of lime wood, its bowl deep enough to hold a single fish without crowding, and its surface polished smooth by use. He dipped the ladle into the barrel and waited until a fish swam over the bowl, and then he lifted it with a smooth motion that hardly disturbed the water, the bream resting in the shallow pool of the ladle with its tail just touching the rim and its gills opening and closing in a steady rhythm. He carried the ladle to the pond's edge and knelt on the grass, and he lowered the bowl into the water with the same smooth care, tilting it slightly so that the bream could feel the new water against its flank. For a moment the fish hesitated, its body motionless in the ladle, and then with a single flick of its tail it darted out into the pond and vanished into the deeper water, a bronze flash that was immediately swallowed by the grey-blue depths. Brother Edwin watched the place where the fish had disappeared, and he saw it reappear a few feet away, swimming more slowly now, exploring the edges of the pond with the cautious movements of a creature finding its bearings in a new world. The second bream followed the first, and then a third, and Brother Simon worked his way through the barrel with the same deliberate care, each fish receiving the same gentle transport from the dark barrel to the bright water. The bream scattered across the pond after their release, some heading for the deeper center and others lingering near the banks where the water was shallower and the clay floor was visible beneath them, their shadows moving across the grey surface like dark thoughts. The ladle rose and dipped and rose again, and the splashing from the barrel grew fainter as the number of fish decreased, and the pond grew slowly more populated with each passing minute. The second barrel held the tench, a different kind of fish entirely, and Brother Edwin saw the difference as soon as the linen cover was lifted. Where the bream had been bronze and bright and quick, the tench were a deep olive green, with small scales set close together and a thick slime that covered their bodies and made them gleam like wet leather. They were slower than the bream, moving in the barrel with the lazy motion of their broad tails, and their mouths were small and slightly downturned, giving them an expression of mild disapproval. Brother Simon lifted the first tench in the ladle, with the same care he had shown the bream, and when he released it into the pond, the fish sank slowly to the bottom and lay there for a moment, its olive body almost invisible against the grey clay, before swimming away with a leisurely undulation into the deeper water. The tench were bottom fish, Brother Simon explained in a low voice as he worked, and they would spend most of their time near the clay floor, rooting in the sediment for the small creatures that would soon colonize the pond, the worms and insect larvae and tiny crustaceans that would form the base of the pond's invisible life. The bream would feed in the middle water and near the surface, and together the two kinds of fish would occupy different parts of the same small world without competing, the way the different offices of the monastery occupied different hours of the same day. Brother Edwin listened and watched, and he understood that the pond was not merely a container of water, but a community, a web of relationships that would develop over time into a stable balance. The third barrel was the smallest, and it held only 6 fish. But these were the pike that would be the lords of the pond, the predators that would keep the bream and tench from multiplying beyond the capacity of the water to sustain them. Brother Simon lifted the first pike with particular caution, because the fish had sharp teeth and a temper that was quick even in the confined space of the barrel. And when he released it into the pond, the pike shot away with a speed that was startling after the slow movements of the tench, a green-grey streak that disappeared into the deepest water and was not seen again. The remaining pike followed, each one a fierce bright presence that vanished instantly, and Brother Edwin felt a small shift in the pond's character, a new element added that would keep the whole in balance. When all the fish were released and the barrel stood empty in the cart, Brother Simon dipped his ladle in the pond water and rinsed it clean, and then he and Brother Edwin walked around the pond together, watching the fish settle into their new home. The bream had begun to school, a loose group of bronze shapes that moved together through the middle water with a synchrony that seemed almost purposeful, and the tench were already rooting near the bottom in the shallower areas, their tails occasionally breaking the surface with a soft plop. The pike were invisible, as they should be, lurking in the shadows at the deepest point and waiting for the small fish that would come in time. Brother Simon stayed for the midday meal, the 2 monks sitting on the turf stack and sharing the bread and cheese that Brother Edwin had brought from the kitchen, and they spoke in quiet voices about the work of fish ponds and the ways of fish and the differences between the waters of Rhea Vaux and the waters of this remote Yorkshire valley. The conversation was slow and easy, with long pauses that were not empty, but full of the sounds of the meadow and the stream and the occasional splash from the pond. And when it was time for Brother Simon to leave, he climbed onto the cart and took up the reins and drove slowly away up the track, with the empty barrels rattling in the bed behind him. The afternoon was quiet, the pond settling into its new life under the pale sky, and Brother Edwin remained at the meadow to watch. He walked slowly around the rim several times, observing the fish from different angles, and he placed a few water plants that he had collected from the stream margin into the shallows at the edges of the pond, a clump of water mint with its purple-green leaves that released a sharp, clean scent when he bruised them, a handful of sedge with its triangular stems and its roots wrapped in a ball of wet mud, a small water lily that he had found growing in a backwater of the stream and had dug up carefully with its tuber intact. He pressed the roots of each plant into the clay at the pond's edge, where they would anchor themselves and grow and provide cover for the fish and oxygen for the water. The sun moved toward the western ridge, and the light thickened into a golden haze that lay across the meadow like honey, and the pond reflected the sky in shades of pale gold and soft grey, and the fish moved beneath the surface like shadows in another world. Brother Edwin sat on the turf stack with his hands resting on his knees and his gaze resting on the water, and he felt the quiet satisfaction of a task completed in accordance with the rule, a piece of work that had begun as a patch of wet grass and was now a living pond full of fish, a source of food for the community that would persist for years after he himself was gone. The bell rang for vespers, its notes falling through the golden air, and he rose and turned toward the track, leaving the pond to the evening, and the fish and the first bats that were already flickering over the water on their sharp, erratic flights. The weeks that followed the stocking of the pond passed with the gentle regularity of monastic time, each day unfolding in its appointed order of prayer and labor and rest, and the pond settled into its new existence as quietly as the fish had settled into the water. Brother Edwin visited the lower meadow every morning after prime, walking down the familiar track through the lengthening grass of late spring, and each day he walked the circuit of the pond and checked the overflow channel and observed the fish. The water had cleared completely now, the fine sediment having settled to the bottom over the course of a week, and the grey-blue clay liner was visible across the entire floor, its smooth surface punctuated only by the dark shapes of the tench that lay there, motionless or moved with a slow undulation of their olive tails. The bream schooled in the middle depths, their bronze flanks catching the light when they turned, and occasionally the long green shadow of a pike would drift out from the deeper centre and then vanish again. A presence felt more than seen. The water plants he had placed at the margins had taken root and begun to spread. The water mint, sending out runners along the shallows, and the sedge putting up new green shoots that stood straight and sharp above the surface. A thin film of algae had appeared on the sunlit areas of the clay, a soft green blush that would become food for the snails and the tiny creatures that were colonizing the pond day by day. Water boatmen skated on the surface, their oar-like legs dimpling the water without breaking through, and the larvae of dragonflies crawled among the stems of the sedge, their alien bodies waiting for the transformation that would carry them into the air. The pond was becoming a world, a small, complete system that required nothing from Brother Edwin except his presence and his observation, and he gave both freely as the spring advanced towards summer. On a Friday morning some weeks after the stocking, Brother Edwin was joined at the pond by Brother Thomas, the young kitchen monk whose duties included the catching and preparation of the fish for the community's Friday meal. Brother Thomas was a man of perhaps 25 years with a cheerful round face and hair that stood up from his tonsure in a manner that suggested energy and impatience, though he had learned to subdue both within the monastery walls. He carried a long-handled net of a type that Brother Edwin had seen before, a simple frame of bent willow supporting a bag of knotted hemp cord, and he also carried a flat basket of woven rushes in which the caught fish would be carried to the kitchen. The two monks greeted each other with the quiet courtesy of their shared life, and then Brother Thomas walked to the edge of the pond and stood looking at the water with the assessing eye of a man who was about to take from it. The net was lowered into the water with a slow, careful motion, the willow frame sinking below the surface and the hemp bag billowing out as the water filled it. Brother Thomas stood motionless, the long handle resting across his shoulder, and Brother Edwin watched from the turf stack with the same attention he had brought to every phase of the pond's creation. The bream that had been schooling near the surface scattered at the intrusion, their bronze bodies flashing away into the deeper water, but the tench that were feeding near the bottom was slower and less wary. After a minute or two of stillness, a large tench swam into the mouth of the net, and Brother Thomas lifted the handle in a single smooth motion that brought the net up through the water and out into the air, the fish thrashing briefly in the hemp bag before subsiding into a resigned stillness. Brother Thomas carried the net to the grass and knelt beside it, and he reached into the bag with both hands and lifted the tench out, the fish's olive body glistening with its thick layer of protective slime. He placed it in the rush basket, and then returned to the pond and repeated the process, catching 2 more tench and 3 bream, before he judged the haul sufficient for the day's meal. The fish lay in the basket, with their gills opening and closing slowly in the air, and Brother Thomas covered them with a square of damp linen to keep them cool and moist during the walk to the kitchen. He thanked Brother Edwin with a nod and a murmured word, and then he walked away up the track, the basket swinging gently from his hand, leaving Brother Edwin alone with the pond that had yielded its first harvest. The preparation of the fish took place in the kitchen yard, a small open space behind the monastery, where a stone table stood beside a channel of running water, diverted from the same stream that fed the pond. Brother Edwin walked up later that morning to observe, not from any need, but from a quiet curiosity about the completion of the cycle that had begun with the first cut of the spade into the turf. Brother Thomas was already at work, his sleeves rolled to the elbow and his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who had cleaned many fish. Each fish was scaled and gutted with a small iron knife. The scales flicked away in silvery showers, and the entrails dropped into a bucket for the monastery's pigs, and then the cleaned fish were washed in the running water and laid on a wooden platter to await the pan. The cooking was done over a small fire in a hearth set into the kitchen wall, a heavy iron pan resting on a trivet above the coals. Brother Thomas added a lump of butter from the monastery's dairy, a pale golden pat that melted slowly and spread across the iron surface with a gentle sizzle, and then he laid the fish in the pan one by one, the flesh hissing as it met the hot metal. The smell of frying fish rose into the morning air, a rich savoury scent that drifted through the kitchen yard and into the cloister walk, and Brother Edwin stood at a respectful distance and watched the fish cook, their skin turning from olive and bronze to a deep golden brown. Brother Thomas added a handful of herbs from the kitchen garden, sage and thyme, and a few leaves of lovage, and he turned the fish once with a wooden spatula before sliding them onto a clean platter. The meal was eaten in the refectory at the midday hour, the monks seated on long benches at the plain wooden tables, while a reader intoned a passage from the rule from a lectern set into the wall. Brother Edwin received his portion on a wooden trencher, a modest piece of the tench with a small heap of boiled beans and a slice of the dark bread, and he ate slowly, tasting the clean, firm flesh of the fish and the faint, earthy sweetness that was the flavor of the pond water itself. The tench was mild and tender, and it flaked easily under his wooden spoon, and the herbs added a complexity that spoke of the garden and the spring, and the bread soaked up the butter and the juices left on the trencher. He ate with gratitude, not a spoken gratitude, but the deep, wordless gratitude of a man who had dug the clay and shaped the basin and watched the water fill, and who now received the fruit of that labor in the company of his brothers. Around him the other monks ate in silence, the only sounds the clink of spoons on trenchers, and the voice of the reader and the distant murmur of the stream that ran past the monastery walls. Brother Edwin thought about the fish that had come from the pond that had come from the clay that had come from the ancient bed of a vanished lake, and he understood that he was part of a chain of causes that stretched back far beyond his own small life, and would stretch forward far beyond it as well. The thought was not a proud one, but simply a recognition, the way a man might recognize his own reflection in still water, and it passed through his mind and faded, leaving only the taste of the fish and the warmth of the meal, and the quiet of the refectory. The seasons turned as they always turned, and the pond changed with them, and Brother Edwin continued his daily visits as the spring gave way to the long, warm days of summer. The grass in the meadow grew tall and was cut for hay, the sweet scent of the drying grass filling the valley for a week in June, and the water level in the pond dropped slightly as the heat drew moisture from the surface, the overflow channel running more slowly and then ceasing altogether for a while. The fish grew fat on the abundant life of the summer water, the bream rising to snap at the flies that landed on the surface, and the tench grubbing among the stems of the water plants with their down-turned mouths. Dragonflies patrolled the edges of the pond on wings that glittered like stained glass, their bodies an electric blue, and their heads turning on flexible necks to follow the movements of smaller insects. The swallows that had arrived in spring had nested under the eaves of the monastery, and now flew low over the water in the evenings, sipping from the surface in quick, delicate touches that left no ripple. Brother Edwin sat often on the turf stack that had been his seat since the first day of the work, the cut squares of grass having long since rooted themselves into the bank and formed a stable grassy rim that looked as if it had always been there. He watched the pond through the long summer afternoons, while the rest of the monastery dozed or worked at lighter tasks, and he saw the reflections shift and change with the passage of the clouds, the grey-blue clay of the bottom giving way to the silver of the sky, and then back again. The pond was a mirror that showed the weather, the mood of the valley, the slow progression of the sun from east to west, and it held all of these things without effort, simply by being still and open and receptive. Autumn came with a coolness in the mornings, and a softening of the light, the green of the meadow grass fading to a tawny gold, and the leaves of the alders turning yellow and drifting down onto the water in slow spirals. The fish grew more sluggish as the temperature dropped, moving less and feeding less, and Brother Edwin saw them less often, their shapes blending into the darkening water. The first heavy rain in September filled the pond to its brim, and the overflow channel ran again, a silver thread that carried the excess back to the stream, and the sound of the water trickling over the flat stone was a thin note that joined the deeper murmur of the stream in a gentle harmony. Brother Edwin cleared the fallen leaves from the surface with a rake made from a forked branch, the wet leaves clinging to the tines and dripping as he lifted them to the bank, and he stacked them in a pile that would become mulch for the kitchen garden. The autumn passed and the first frosts arrived, the grass crunching under his sandals on the morning walks, and the edges of the pond rimed with a thin crust of ice that melted as the sun rose. The water grew very clear in the cold, the clay floor visible in every detail, and the fish moved slowly near the bottom, their metabolism slowing to match the temperature, their need for food reduced to almost nothing. Brother Edwin broke the ice of the edge of the pond on the coldest mornings, using a pole of alderwood to crack a channel along the shallows so that the fish could breathe, the ice shattering with a sharp crystalline sound that echoed across the silent meadow. The pond in winter was a quieter thing, a darker thing. its surface a black mirror that reflected the grey sky and the bare branches of the alders and the slow fall of snow when it came. The snow came several times that winter, each snowfall a soft blanket that lay over the meadow and muffled all sound, and the pond became a white circle in a white field, its presence marked only by the slight depression of the banks and the single dark hole that Brother Edwin kept open at the edge. He walked down the track through the snow with his sandals wrapped in sacking, the cold numbing his toes and his breath hanging in clouds before his face, and he stood at the edge of the pond and watched the small movements of the fish beneath the ice, their shapes dim and slow in the dark water. The monastery bell rang the hours through the cold air, its notes falling through the snow as clearly as they had fallen through the spring rain, and the stream continued to run beneath its own ice, the murmur audible as a faint vibration in the ground, and the life of the valley went on in its winter stillness until the first thaw came. The return of spring was a gradual thing, a softening of the light and a warmth in the air that was barely perceptible at first, and then the first green shoots appeared in the meadow, and the alders put out their catkins, and the swallows returned from the south to nest under the eaves once more. Brother Edwin walked down the track on a morning in April, a full year after he had first stood in the lower meadow and marked out the shape of the pond with a knotted cord, and he found the pond much as he had left it in the autumn, its water clear and its banks firm, and its fish swimming with the renewed vigor of the warming season. The water plants that had died back in the winter were sending up new shoots from the clay, pale green points that broke the surface and opened into leaves, and the first water beetles of the year were already skating on the surface, as if the winter had been nothing but a brief interruption. He sat on the turf stack in the evening light, the same evening light that had fallen on the valley for all the years of his life and for all the years before his life, and he watched the swallows skim the surface of the pond, their flight a series of sharp turns and sudden ascents that seemed to be writing a language he could almost understand. The stream murmured beside him, as it had murmured through every hour of the digging and the puddling and the lining, as it had murmured through the summer heat and the autumn rain and the winter frost, and it would murmur through the years ahead, feeding the pond that he had made, carrying the overflow back to its source, sustaining the fish that would feed the brothers who would come after him. The bell rang for Compline, the last office of the day, and Brother Edwin rose from the turf stack and walked slowly up the track toward the monastery, his sandals leaving dark prints in the dew-wet grass, the pond behind him fading into the twilight, its surface a dim mirror that held the first stars and the dark shapes of the alders and the quiet life that moved beneath, patient and eternal.